At 8 in the morning, my daughter-in-law called demanding I wire my entire $360,000 retirement fund so they could bid on a house. When I drove to their rental to refuse in person, I found a brand new $100,000 luxury vehicle sitting in their driveway. I quietly turned my truck around, went home, and unplugged my phone. That was the moment the war began. I am Garrett, 69 years old and a retired construction contractor. Before I dive deep into this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to stand your ground against family members who completely underestimated your intelligence. The shrill ring of my cell phone shattered the quiet peace of my morning routine. I was sitting at my kitchen table watching the steam rise from my black coffee when I saw Courtney's name flash on the screen. My daughter-in-law rarely called me unless she needed something, but the frantic tone in her voice this time was entirely new. She did not bother asking how I was doing or say good morning. She launched straight into a breathless demand. "Garrett, I need you to wire the $360,000 deposit right now," she barked, her voice echoing loudly through the receiver. "The housing auction starts at noon, and we cannot lose this property." I sat there in absolute silence, processing the sheer audacity of her request. She was talking about every single penny I had saved from 40 years of breaking my back in the commercial construction business. Before I could even form a proper response, there was a panicked shuffle on the line, and my son Devin took the phone. His voice was entirely different from his wife's. It was thin, trembling, and heavy with manufactured desperation. "Dad, please, you have to help us," he begged. "We are drowning in debt, and this house is our only way out to start fresh. If we do not secure this bid, we are going to lose absolutely everything." The desperation in his voice tugged hard at my paternal instincts, but my gut instinct told me something was terribly wrong. I told them I would drive over right away, and we would discuss the money in person. I grabbed my keys and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The drive to their neighborhood usually took about 20 minutes, but today, every single mile felt like an eternity. My mind kept looping back to Devin's exact words. "We are drowning in debt." As I gripped the worn steering wheel of my old reliable pickup truck, a flood of heavy memories washed over me. I remembered what real drowning felt like. I remembered the brutal winter of 1995. Devin was just 7 years old, and his asthma was so severe that the freezing city wind would send him into terrifying wheezing fits that kept us up all night. My late wife Nadine and I had zero savings back then. To pay for his frequent emergency room visits, his expensive inhalers, and the breathing machine that kept him alive, I worked double shifts at the commercial concrete plant. I remembered waking up at 3 in the morning, stepping into boots that were still damp from the day before, and walking out into freezing temperatures. My hands were so severely cracked and blistered from the cold concrete that they would bleed through my heavy work gloves. I never complained once. Nadine and I sacrificed every ounce of our comfort eating cheap meals and skipping our own doctor appointments just to make sure our little boy could breathe easy and sleep soundly. We built a life out of dust and sweat so he would never have to know the crushing weight of real poverty. Now, 30 years later, that same boy was using the breath I broke my back to secure to beg for my life savings. He wanted me to hand over my absolute last financial safety net to appease a woman who looked at me like dirt on her designer shoes. The emotional pain sitting tight in my chest slowly began to crystallize into something much colder. I realized I was driving toward a house of cards. I just did not know how fragile it was until I turned the corner onto their street. Their rental home was situated in an upscale suburban neighborhood with manicured lawns and wide, quiet streets. As my truck rolled down the block, I prepared myself for the heartbreaking sight of a young couple supposedly crushed by financial ruin. I expected to see signs of genuine struggle. Instead, my eyes locked onto the driveway and my heavy work boots slammed instinctively on the brake pedal. Sitting right there, gleaming perfectly under the morning sun, was a brand new midnight black luxury SUV. It was completely immaculate. The dealership plates were still bolted to the bumpers, and the rich caramel leather interior was easily visible through the pristine tinted windows. This was not a used vehicle or a sensible family car. This was a top-of-the-line machine that easily cost upward of $100,000. I threw my truck into park and just stared at it while the engine idled loudly. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots between Devin's tearful plea of drowning in debt and the mechanical beast of luxury parked proudly outside their front door. They were not broke. They were not struggling to put food on the table or keep the lights on. They were living a massive, lavish lie. Courtney had always been obsessed with projecting a level of wealth she absolutely did not possess. I remembered the designer handbags she flaunted at family dinners and the expensive vacations they took while claiming they could not afford to help pay for my late wife's funeral. But this was a completely new level of deceit. They were funding a high society lifestyle while attempting to emotionally manipulate a retired old man into paying their tabs. The absolute sheer disrespect of it all burned through me like a physical fever. My son, the boy I had bled for, was actively conspiring with his entitled wife to steal my future so she could parade around town in a luxury vehicle. The deep sadness I had felt just 20 minutes ago vanished entirely. The loving, trusting father who would have given them the shirt off his back died in the driver's seat of that old pickup truck. In his place emerged the hardened contractor who had spent decades surviving the most ruthless, cutthroat industry in the world. You do not survive 40 years in commercial construction by being soft, and you certainly do not survive by letting thieves into your house. My hands stopped trembling. My breathing slowed. The anger evaporated, leaving behind a terrifyingly clear sense of purpose. I knew exactly what I had to do. I did not open my car door. I did not march up to their porch and demand an explanation. Giving them a screaming match would only give them an opportunity to craft more lies and play the victims. Instead, I shifted my truck into reverse. I backed out of their quiet street and drove the long way home, enjoying the steady hum of my engine. When I walked through my front door, I went straight to the kitchen. I unplugged the landline cord from the wall. I took my cell phone out of my pocket, powered it down completely, and tossed it into a dark drawer. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, sat in my favorite armchair, and listened to the absolute perfect silence of my house. The antique clock on the mantel ticked away. 11 o'clock, 11:30, 12 noon. The real estate auction started and passed. I knew exactly the kind of panic that was happening on the other side of town. At exactly 5 minutes past noon, the heavy wooden door of my house shuddered violently as someone began kicking it like they wanted to rip the hinges straight out of the frame. The heavy oak door shook in its frame from the violent pounding. I did not rush. I walked at my normal measured pace, feeling the solid hardwood floor beneath my feet, and calmly unlocked the deadbolt. The door flew open so fast the brass handle struck the drywall, leaving a deep visible dent. Courtney pushed past me, her face flushed a furious shade of red. Devin trailed closely behind her, looking completely pathetic and avoiding my eyes. "You lost us?" "The house," she screamed, her voice echoing sharply off my high ceilings. "The auction closed 10 minutes ago and some cash buyer snatched our dream home right out from under us. You could have wired that deposit money, Garrett. You have it just sitting in the bank collecting dust." She threw her designer leather purse onto my antique sofa and pointed a freshly manicured finger directly at my chest. "I am carrying your only grandchild," she spat, her eyes wide with manufactured rage. "How can you be such a useless, selfish old man? Do you want your grandchild growing up in a cramped rental? Do you want us struggling like peasants while you hoard wealth in this massive, empty house?" I stood by the open front door and slowly pushed it closed until the latch clicked. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself against her ridiculous accusations. I just looked at her, taking in the expensive silk blouse she wore and the fresh salon blowout that cost more than a week's worth of groceries for most hardworking families. The sheer blatant entitlement radiating from her was suffocating like a toxic cloud filling my hallway. I walked past them, ignoring her outburst entirely, and headed straight for the kitchen. I picked up the glass carafe from the counter and poured myself a second cup of black coffee. The dark liquid splashed softly against the ceramic mug, filling the room with the rich, comforting aroma of roasted beans. My absolute silence seemed to deeply unnerve Devin. He stepped forward, holding his hands up in a desperate defensive gesture. "Dad, come on, you have to understand," he pleaded, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure. "We needed a reliable vehicle. Courtney is pregnant. We cannot be driving around in something dangerous or old. The Range Rover was an investment for the baby's safety. Safety." The word bounced around my brain like a sick, twisted joke. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the intense bitterness sit on my tongue. I looked at my son from head to toe. He was wearing a brand new smartwatch designer jeans and pristine white sneakers that had never seen a hard day's work. My mind instantly pulled me back to the brutal winter of 2002. My late wife Nadine drove a rusted-out 1998 Honda Civic for 15 solid years. The heater barely worked, leaving her shivering on her winter commutes, and the passenger side window was permanently stuck halfway down. Every single time she hit a pothole, the rusted exhaust pipe would rattle aggressively against the freezing pavement. I remembered her waking up early to scrape thick ice off that cracked windshield with bare hands. But she drove that old metal death trap to her exhausting nursing job every single day without uttering a single complaint. She did it so we could put every extra dollar into a college fund for Devin. She did it so he could graduate university without the crushing weight of student loans hanging over his neck. She willingly traded her own comfort, her own physical safety, and her own dignity for his bright future. And now the boy we sacrificed absolutely everything for was standing in my kitchen trying to convince me that a $100,000 luxury SUV was a necessary safety measure for a child that was not even born yet. The contrast was so sharp it physically hurt my chest. But I did not let them see me bleed. I simply placed my mug down on the granite counter with a dull, heavy thud. "Get out," I said softly. My voice was extremely low, but it carried the absolute weight of 40 years giving orders on loud, dangerous construction sites. Courtney opened her mouth to argue further, but Devin grabbed her arm tight. He knew that specific tone of voice. He knew it meant the conversation was entirely over and pushing any further would be dangerous. They turned and stormed out, leaving my house as abruptly as they had entered. When the sound of their heavy engine faded down the quiet street, I walked over to the front window and let out a long, slow breath. I needed to focus my mind. I walked out to the metal mailbox at the end of my long concrete driveway. The afternoon sun beat down heavily on my shoulders as I pulled out a thick stack of envelopes. Most of it was standard junk mail flyers and grocery coupons, but one particular envelope caught my eye. It was thick, crisp, and bore the embossed logo of a major national auto finance corporation. I had not financed a vehicle in over a decade. I always paid straight cash for my work trucks. A cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach as I tore the envelope open right there on the warm sidewalk. I pulled out the formal multi-page statement and scanned the bold black ink. My vision blurred for a fraction of a second before the terrible reality snapped into extremely sharp focus. It was a legally binding loan agreement for a $112,000 vehicle, a 2024 Range Rover. The primary borrower was listed as Devin, but right there underneath his name on the solid line reserved for the financial guarantor was my full legal name, Garrett. I was listed as the primary co-signer. I stared at the paper until the numbers seemed to lift off the bright white page. The interest rate was astronomically high, indicating Devin's credit score was completely trashed. They had leveraged my pristine credit score, my decades of flawless financial history, to secure this massive luxury loan. But I had never signed a single piece of paper. I had never spoken to any dealership representative. I had never authorized a hard pull on my personal credit report. To co-sign a loan of this magnitude required multiple forms of verification, physical signatures, and verbal consent. How could they possibly bypass the strict fraud prevention measures of a major national bank? I walked back inside, tossing the rest of the useless mail onto the hallway table. I spread the finance documents out on the kitchen island and scrutinized every single page with the precision of a hawk. On the final page of the extensive agreement, there was a digital signature block. It did not contain my handwritten signature. It contained an electronic authorization stamp attached to an IP address. They had forged my legal consent. They had tied a massive six-figure debt directly to my social security number. If they missed even one monthly payment, the bank would come straight after my retirement funds and put a lien on my property. The house of cards I suspected they were living in was not just built on childish lies. It was built on a firm foundation of federal financial fraud. And they had built it using my stolen identity. I immediately grabbed my cell phone from the drawer and dialed the urgent fraud department number listed on the back of the finance statement. I navigated the automated menus with a cold, mechanical precision, pressing the buttons with forceful purpose. When a live representative finally answered, I did not waste any time with polite pleasantries. I told the young man on the line that a fraudulent six-figure auto loan had been opened using my social security number, and I needed the entire account frozen immediately pending a police investigation. The representative typed quickly on his keyboard and placed me on a brief hold. The terrible tinny elevator music played in my ear while my mind calculated the severe legal ramifications of what my son had just done to me. The line clicked back over, breaking the silence. Mr. Garrett, the representative said carefully, his tone entirely different now. I am looking at the digital authorization logs right now on my screen. This loan was not flagged as fraudulent because it was electronically authorized by your legally designated medical and financial proxy. The representative paused for a heavy second before dropping the absolute hammer. It was legally approved by Courtney. The word proxy hung in the heavy air of my kitchen like a death sentence. I did not yell at the young bank representative on the phone. Yelling would not erase the digital footprint Courtney had somehow manufactured. I simply thanked the young man for his time and ended the call, pressing the red button with a dangerously calm finger. My mind raced, analyzing the structural integrity of my own life the same way I used to analyze the blueprints of a 30-story commercial high-rise. If she had managed to forge a proxy document convincing enough to pass the rigorous legal department of a national auto finance corporation, my personal bank accounts were completely exposed. Every single dollar I had saved, every investment portfolio I had built over 40 years of backbreaking labor was sitting in a vault that this deceitful woman now had the keys to. She did not just steal a car, she had stolen my legal identity. I grabbed my heavy jacket and a thick fireproof folder containing my original identity documents, my birth certificate, my passport, and my social security card. I did not bother calling my son. Devin was either a willing, active accomplice in this massive fraud, or he was too cowardly to stand up and stop his wife. Either way, he was completely useless to me now. I walked out to my truck, the afternoon sun feeling entirely cold against my skin. I drove straight to the main branch of my bank downtown. The tires of my truck gripped the asphalt with the same fierce intensity I felt tightening in my chest. I had to freeze absolutely everything. I had to lock the vault before Courtney could drain the absolute lifeblood of my retirement and leave me dying in the dirt. I walked through the heavy double-glass doors of the bank, bypassing the busy teller line and heading straight for the branch manager's private office. A young assistant in a tight suit tried to intercept me, but I moved with a heavy, determined stride that made him immediately step aside. The manager, Mr. Caldwell, was a man I had done business with for over 15 years. He had personally overseen the financing for several of my massive construction projects. When I sat down in the leather chair opposite his mahogany desk, I expected the usual firm handshake and professional courtesy. Instead, Caldwell looked up from his dual computer screens with a deeply uncomfortable, almost pitying expression. He clasped his manicured hands together and leaned forward, offering me a patronizing smile that you would typically reserve for a lost child wandering a grocery store. "Mr. Garrett, it is incredibly good to see you," he said slowly, over-articulating his words as if I were deaf. "Courtney called us just an hour ago to check on your balances. She mentioned you were having a particularly difficult week and might come in confused about your accounts." The absolute sheer cunning of it made my blood run cold. She had poisoned the well before I even arrived. Caldwell reached out across the desk as if to physically pat my hand. "She sent over the medical and financial power of attorney documents this morning. Our legal team is reviewing them right now. Do not worry, sir, your family is taking great care of your finances. You are in very good hands. If I had been an ordinary man, I would have screamed until my lungs gave out. I would have flipped his heavy desk, grabbed him by his expensive silk tie, and demanded they call the police immediately. But I am not an ordinary man. In the brutal summer of 1989, I faced down a notoriously corrupt city inspector who tried to extort my construction firm by threatening to condemn a multi-million-dollar apartment complex I was building. He sat across from me in a humid trailer with that exact same smug, patronizing smile demanding a massive bribe. I did not yell then either. I quietly gathered the hard evidence of his extortion, handed it directly to the federal authorities, and stood on the sidewalk watching them escort him out of City Hall in heavy steel handcuffs. Anger is a massive liability in a war. Calmness is a lethal weapon. I did not blink. I looked Caldwell dead in the eyes, my voice dropping a full octave, filling the quiet office with absolute authority. "Mr. Caldwell, I am of completely sound mind, and I have never signed a power of attorney for anyone in my entire life. You have known me for 15 uninterrupted years. Do I look confused to you? I want my accounts frozen immediately." Caldwell shifted incredibly uncomfortably in his expensive chair. The steady, unblinking intensity of my gaze completely shattered the frail illusion Courtney had carefully painted for him. The authoritative tone of my voice reminded him exactly who he was dealing with. He nervously typed his complex password into the system and brought up my main financial profiles. As the primary account owner standing physically in the branch with government-issued photographic identification, you have the ultimate authority. He admitted, adjusting his tie with a slightly shaking hand. I instructed him to immediately freeze all outbound wire transfers and permanently lock every single credit card attached to my name or my social security number. But as I sat there watching the screen reflect in his glasses, I knew a simple account freeze was absolutely not enough. If Courtney dragged me into a prolonged legal battle over the forged proxy documents, she could easily petition a corrupt or sympathetic judge to unfreeze the assets for my supposed medical care. I needed to move the capital out of her reach entirely. "Caldwell," I said, leaning closer to his desk, my voice barely above a whisper. "Before you apply the hard freeze, I need to execute a massive domestic transfer to my secondary holding company, $358,800. Caldwell's eyes went wide with absolute shock. He looked at the screen and then back at me. "Sir, that leaves exactly $1,200 in your primary checking account." I nodded slowly. "That is exactly correct. Execute the transfer right now." What Caldwell did not know, and what Courtney could never possibly discover, was that the secondary holding company was a blind corporate entity I established over a decade ago. It funneled directly into a highly secure offshore trust account located in the Cayman Islands. I had set it up back when my business was rapidly expanding as an absolute fail-safe against catastrophic corporate lawsuits and aggressive predatory developers. I never in a million years thought I would have to use it to protect myself from my own flesh and blood. Caldwell nervously processed the massive transaction. The heavy keyboard clicks echoed loudly in the quiet bank office. Within 3 minutes, the massive sum of money completely vanished from the local financial grid. It was now untraceable, untouchable, and absolutely secure from any domestic legal maneuvering. Courtney thought she was a brilliant mastermind for forging a proxy document to buy a luxury car. She had absolutely no idea she was playing chess against a man who spent his entire life building skyscrapers from the dirt up. She wanted to play dirty financial games with my life savings. I had just effectively wiped the entire board clean, let her try to steal from an empty vault. I left the bank feeling a dark, heavy sense of satisfaction. The afternoon traffic was thick, but I drove back to my house in total silence, plotting my next counterattack. When I finally pulled into my long concrete driveway, the temporary satisfaction instantly evaporated into the warm air. A plain, unmarked white sedan was parked along the curb, and a tall man in a cheap gray suit was standing directly on my front porch, holding a thick manila envelope. I threw my truck into park, stepped out, and walked up the pathway with my fists clenched at my sides. "Mr. Garrett?" the man asked, stepping forward to meet me on the grass. "Yes," I replied flatly. My eyes locked onto the document in his hand. "You have been served," he said, pushing the heavy envelope directly into my chest before quickly turning around and walking briskly back to his car. I stood on my front porch and tore open the thick paper seal. It was a formal legal petition to the state court. Courtney was not just trying to steal my money. She had escalated the war to a terrifying new level. She had officially filed for an involuntary emergency conservatorship over my entire life. According to the attached medical affidavit, which was filled with absolute fabrications, she was claiming I suffered from severe, rapidly progressing dementia and was a total immediate danger to myself. I stood frozen on my front porch, the warm afternoon breeze ruffling the thick pages of the legal petition in my hands. The heavy black ink spelled out my absolute destruction. Courtney was not just trying to cover up her massive credit fraud or steal a down payment for a new house. She was making a calculated, aggressive play for my entire multi-million-dollar estate. I flipped through the sworn medical affidavits where she had somehow found a corrupt doctor willing to testify that I was suffering from severe, rapidly progressing cognitive decline. The petition demanded the court grant her total and immediate control over my physical health, my living arrangements, and every single financial asset tied to my name. If a judge signed this final order, I would legally cease to be an independent human being. I would be reduced to the status of a helpless child, with Courtney holding the absolute power to put me in a locked care facility and liquidate my life savings to fund her luxury lifestyle. She wanted the house, she wanted my pension, she wanted my lucrative corporate dividends, and she wanted everything I had built over 40 years of bleeding in the dirt. The absolute audacity of her greed was staggering. I carefully folded the heavy documents and slid them back into the manila envelope. I did not panic. Panic is the absolute enemy of survival. Instead, I walked straight back to my truck, started the heavy engine, and gripped the steering wheel with a terrifying calmness. I drove downtown to a sleek, high-rise glass building that housed the most ruthless corporate law firm in the state. Aaron was a former federal prosecutor who had represented my commercial construction firm for over 20 years. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who never lost a case because he possessed absolutely zero capacity for mercy or hesitation. When I walked into his spacious corner office and threw the thick legal petition onto his heavy mahogany desk, he did not even flinch. He picked up the document, scanned the pages with cold, calculating eyes, and let out a short, humorless laugh. "They are moving incredibly fast, Garrett," he said, leaning back in his leather chair. "An emergency ex parte hearing means they are trying to strip your rights before you even have a chance to mount a proper defense." I sat down opposite him and crossed my arms firmly. "I already secured the liquid assets in the offshore trust," I told him. "But she wants the real estate and the corporate residuals." Aaron tapped his expensive silver pen against the desk. "We could fight this aggressively right now," he suggested. "We could file an immediate injunction, challenge the medical affidavit, and drag them through years of brutal public litigation." I shook my head slowly. "No," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch. "If we block her now, she will just retreat and find another quiet way to attack me in the dark. We are going to let her think she is winning. We are going to let her walk right into the trap." Aaron stopped tapping his pen and looked at me with a deep, predatory understanding. It was the exact same silent tactical maneuver I had used back in the brutal summer of 1986. Back then, a massive corrupt steel supplier tried to aggressively bleed my young company dry by withholding critical building materials and attempting a hostile financial takeover. Instead of fighting them loudly in the press or in the immediate courts, I played incredibly weak. I let them think I was bankrupt and completely desperate. I allowed them to overextend their massive credit lines to swallow what they thought was my dying company. The moment they were financially exposed and absolutely certain of their victory, I snapped the trap shut using a hidden secondary supplier and a mountain of their own documented federal tax evasion. They lost absolutely everything in 48 hours, and their leadership went to federal prison. I destroyed them with pure, absolute silence. I was going to do the exact same thing to my own daughter-in-law. "We do not object to the initial temporary conservatorship," I told Aaron. "We let her take the wheel. Then we drive her straight off the cliff." Aaron immediately began drafting the necessary countermeasures and setting up the invisible legal tripwires that would eventually destroy her. I left his office feeling a deep, cold sense of clarity. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the city streets as I drove back to my quiet suburban neighborhood. I expected to spend the evening alone, sitting in my dark living room and mentally preparing for the brutal war ahead. But as I turned onto my familiar tree-lined street, I immediately noticed a massive, unfamiliar moving truck parked haphazardly across my pristine front lawn. Deep, heavy tire tracks were brutally carved into the manicured grass I had maintained for 2 decades. Several large, heavy cardboard boxes were stacked recklessly on my front porch, crushing Nadine's beloved rose bushes. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs, but I forced my face into a mask of absolute calm. I parked my truck in the driveway and walked slowly up the concrete path. This house was not just brick and mortar to me. It was a monument to every sacrifice my wife and I had made. It was the sanctuary where I nursed Nadine through her final days. Seeing it violated by strangers' boxes felt like a physical knife twisting in my gut. The heavy brass lock on my solid oak front door looked entirely different. It was shiny, brand new, and completely lacked the familiar scratches from years of my daily use. I pulled my heavy key ring from my pocket and slid my house key into the lock. It hit a solid metal barrier halfway in. It did not turn. I pulled the key out and tried again, pushing harder. Nothing. The entire deadbolt system had been professionally replaced. I took a step back and looked at the large front windows. The heavy custom curtains Nadine had hand-stitched 20 years ago were completely gone, violently ripped down and replaced by cheap, modern plastic blinds. Through the glass, I could see strange, ugly furniture sitting in my beautiful living room. A sickening wave of realization washed over me. Courtney had not just filed the emergency petition. She had somehow used the pending status of the court documents to convince a local locksmith that she had legal authority over the property. She was aggressively invading my personal sanctuary while I was downtown preparing my legal defense. She was moving in and taking over my life before a judge had even signed a single piece of paper. Before I could even raise my heavy fist to knock, the brand new deadbolt clicked loudly from the inside. The heavy oak door swung open wide. Courtney stood there blocking the threshold. She was wearing comfortable, expensive loungewear and holding a large glass of my premium imported red wine that she had obviously taken from my private cellar. She swirled the dark red liquid in her glass, entirely unbothered by the fact that she was committing domestic theft. A smug, incredibly triumphant smirk was plastered across her face. Behind her, I could clearly see Devon carrying a large flat-screen television up the wooden stairs toward my master bedroom. Courtney took a slow, arrogant sip of her wine and looked me up and down, as if I were a lost, pathetic beggar standing on her property. "You are home early, Garrett," she said, her voice dripping with fake, sugary concern. "Do not look so confused." The court agreed. "You absolutely should not be living alone in your rapidly declining condition." "We packed up our rental this afternoon." She stepped aside, gesturing broadly to the massive mess of boxes in my hallway. "We have moved in to take care of you." I stood on my own front porch looking at the woman who had just orchestrated the hostile takeover of my entire life. I let my broad shoulders sag intentionally under my heavy winter coat. I let the thick legal envelope slip slightly from my grip, allowing my large hands to tremble just enough to sell the grand illusion. "Oh, Courtney," I muttered, letting my voice crack with manufactured fragility and deep confusion. "I do not understand what is happening here. Why are there moving boxes everywhere?" Her smug smile widened into a look of absolute wicked triumph. She was holding a large crystal glass filled with my premium imported red wine. The sheer audacity of her drinking my private reserve while actively evicting me from my own living room was staggering. She took another slow, arrogant sip and stepped aside, motioning for me to enter the main hallway with a grand, sweeping gesture. "It is very simple, Garrett," she said, speaking to me slowly and loudly as if I were a very slow toddler. "The judge signed an emergency temporary order this afternoon. You are a certified danger to yourself. Your mind is going fast. So Devon and I are stepping up to manage your daily care and your vast property. We have already claimed the master bedroom upstairs to prepare for the baby." She walked past the living room and over to the narrow wooden door tucked neatly under the main staircase. She yanked it open. A rush of stale, musty air wafted up from the absolute darkness below. She pointed a freshly manicured finger down the steep wooden steps leading into the damp, unfinished cellar. "We set up a small cot for you down there," she stated, her tone entirely devoid of any human empathy. "It is perfectly safe, and it keeps you completely out of our way while we renovate the main floors to suit our modern tastes. This is your new room." I looked down into the pitch-black stairwell. I could hear the heavy thumping of Devon's footsteps on the floorboards directly above me as he arranged his expensive designer clothes in the bedroom I had shared with his mother for 30 beautiful years. He did not come downstairs to help me with my bags. He did not even peek around the corner to look his father in the eye. He was a complete coward, hiding behind the vicious skirts of his greedy wife while she banished me to the dark underground. I slowly picked up the small battered suitcase I kept packed for emergencies in the back of my truck. I leaned heavily on the wooden handrail and began my slow, agonizing descent down the narrow stairs. Each wooden step groaned loudly under my weight. Courtney stood at the top of the stairs, watching me struggle with absolute unblinking satisfaction before violently slamming the door shut. The loud click of the heavy lock plunged me into near-total darkness. The damp chill of the underground air immediately seeped through my thin shirt, but the raging fire burning deep in my chest kept me entirely warm. I reached out and pulled the string of a single bare bulb hanging in the center of the basement, bathing the damp concrete walls in a sickly yellow light. They thought they were sending me to a miserable dungeon. They thought the cold gray walls and the unfinished concrete floors would break my spirit and hasten my supposed mental decline. They had absolutely no idea they were throwing a highly calculated predator directly into his own perfectly constructed den. As I looked around the large unfinished space, my mind immediately traveled back to the blistering hot summer of 1982. I was a young, ambitious contractor trying to build a safe fortress for my growing family. I dug this entire massive foundation out by hand using nothing but a heavy steel shovel and raw determination. When the concrete trucks finally arrived, I spent 14 grueling hours straight smoothing and leveling this very floor with my own bare hands. My blood and sweat were literally mixed into the foundation of this house. I knew every single inch of this basement. I knew exactly where the foundation naturally settled, where the seasonal moisture collected, and more importantly, I knew exactly where the structural voids were located. To them, this was just a dirty, cold storage room meant for garbage and a dying old man. To me, it was the bedrock of an empire I had forged out of absolutely nothing. I sat down on the cheap military-style cot they had haphazardly placed in the corner. The thin mattress crunched uncomfortably underneath me. I let out a low, dark chuckle that echoed ominously off the thick concrete walls. Courtney wanted to play the powerful role of the absolute warden. She did not realize she had just locked me inside my own command center. I waited silently in the dim light, listening intently to the muffled sounds of their heavy footsteps moving rapidly across the ceiling above me. Once I was absolutely certain they were fully occupied with unpacking their stolen luxury goods in my custom kitchen, I stood up from the cot. My trembling hands became completely steady. The frail, confused old man persona instantly vanished into the cold air. I walked past the massive old water heater and the dusty stacks of forgotten holiday decorations, moving carefully toward the far back corner of the western foundation wall. To the untrained eye, the heavy cinder block masonry looked completely uniform and solid. But I had personally laid every single block of this massive structure. I reached down to the third row from the bottom, heavily obscured by the permanent shadow of the wooden staircase. I pressed my thick fingers firmly against the rough edges of one specific block and pushed hard. It slid smoothly backward with a soft grinding sound, revealing a deep rectangular cavity hidden perfectly within the structural foundation. I reached deep into the cold, dark void and pulled out a heavy black fireproof lockbox. I carried it over to the cot, set it down carefully on the thin blanket, and spun the mechanical combination dial. 4 quick, precise turns, and the heavy metal latch sprang open. Inside lay the absolute ultimate weapons of my silent war. First was a thick stack of verified legal documents protected in a heavy waterproof sleeve. It contained the original physical deed to the property bearing my ink signature and the official raised county seal. Courtney thought the digital records she hacked were the only things that mattered in the real world. She had no idea how aggressive real estate law actually functioned when challenged by physical authenticated paper trails. Second, and far more important, was a small black velvet pouch tucked firmly into the corner of the metal box. I opened the drawstring and poured the contents into my calloused palm. It was a high-grade micro-recording device. It was the exact size of a standard computer flash drive, painted a matte black to completely avoid light reflection. I had purchased it years ago to discreetly record aggressive union negotiations and corrupt supply drops on loud commercial job sites. The internal battery life was exceptional, lasting for weeks on standby, and the tiny microphone was incredibly sensitive, capable of picking up soft whispers from entirely across a large, crowded room. I pressed the tiny rubber power button. A microscopic green light flashed once, indicating it was fully operational and ready to capture every single vile secret Courtney and Devin thought they were safely discussing upstairs. I slipped the recording device into my front shirt pocket and locked the heavy metal box, placing it securely back into the hidden wall cavity. I slid the cinder block back into its flawless position, wiping away the small trace of dust from the smooth concrete floor. I was just turning back toward my cot to plan my next move when a massive, jarring crash echoed through the floorboards directly above my head. It was a violent, devastating sound I recognized instantly. The heavy, unmistakable reverberation of thick piano wire snapping under extreme, sudden physical pressure. I froze completely still, my eyes locked onto the wooden ceiling. Heavy work boots stomped loudly across the hardwood floor of the main living room. Then Courtney's shrill, commanding voice pierced right through the floor joists clear as day. "Just tip it completely over and drag it out the front door," she barked loudly to the movers upstairs. "I do not care if it violently scratches the floor. We are replacing that cheap old wood anyway. Throw that ugly antique piece of junk in the dumpster before the neighbors see it." My heart stopped dead in my chest. She was not talking about a random piece of junk. She was talking about Nadine's piano. The beautiful mahogany upright piano I had bought for my wife on our 10th wedding anniversary after saving every spare dime for 3 long years. I could almost hear the soft melodic tunes Nadine used to play, filling our home with absolute warmth and love. It was the very same piano she used to play for Devin every single night to soothe his brutal asthma attacks and gently put him to sleep. The violent crashing sound upstairs was not just the destruction of a musical instrument. It was the deliberate, vicious desecration of my late wife's beautiful memory. I stood in the dark, damp basement, my hands balling into fists so incredibly tight my knuckles turned completely white. The sheer violent sound of the piano crashing against the hardwood floor pulled me out of the basement shadows. I forced my white-knuckled hands to unclench. I took a deep, jagged breath and instantly morphed my posture. My shoulders slumped dramatically, and a severe tremor took over my hands. I pushed open the basement door and stumbled into the main hallway, blinking rapidly against the bright overhead lights. "Stop, please stop!" I cried out, letting my voice waver with manufactured panic. "What are you doing to Nadine's piano?" Two large, burly movers were standing in the center of the living room, looking completely annoyed. The beautiful, polished mahogany instrument was lying on its side, its delicate wooden legs splintered and broken. Courtney spun around, clutching her wine glass, her eyes narrowing with intense irritation. "I told you to stay downstairs, Garrett," she snapped, pointing her finger toward the basement door. "We are clearing out the garbage to make room for the new sectional sofa." I shuffled forward, reaching out toward the broken wood with trembling fingers. "Please," I begged, letting real tears sting the corners of my eyes. "That belonged to my wife. It is not garbage." Courtney rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck in her head. She gestured aggressively to the movers. "Just get it out of here," she ordered. "Ignore him. His mind is completely gone." I stood there playing the role of the helpless widower while they brutally dragged the remains of my wife's memory out the front door. Once the heavy front door slammed shut, Courtney turned her full venomous attention back to me. "Since you are up here wandering around like a ghost, you might as well eat." She sighed heavily. She marched into the kitchen and I shuffled weakly behind her. She did not offer me the roasted chicken and organic vegetables I saw resting on the stove. Instead, she opened a dusty cabinet, grabbed a dented can of the cheapest sodium-heavy chicken noodle soup, and violently dumped it into a plastic bowl. She shoved it into the microwave without even covering it. I stood by the kitchen island, leaning heavily against the granite countertop as if I could barely support my own weight. Courtney leaned against the opposite counter, pouring herself another generous serving of my vintage Cabernet Sauvignon. She took a slow, luxurious sip, letting out a soft sigh of complete satisfaction. "You are going to have to learn to follow the new rules around here, Garrett." She lectured, her tone dripping with intense condescension. "I cannot have you wandering up here confusing the contractors and getting in my way. You are a massive liability." I looked down at the scratched plastic bowl she pushed toward me. The lukewarm soup smelled incredibly artificial. I picked up a cheap metal spoon and began to eat slowly. Every single bite felt like swallowing ashes. My mind drifted back to the early days of building this kitchen. I had custom designed this exact granite island so Nadine would have plenty of space to roll out her famous pie crusts during the holidays. She used to stand exactly where Courtney was standing now, laughing with flour on her nose while the house smelled of cinnamon and baked apples. Nadine treated everyone who walked through our door with absolute warmth and dignity. Now her own son had married a woman who treated me worse than a stray dog in the very room I built for her. I finished the terrible soup and wiped my mouth with a paper towel. As I turned to place the plastic bowl in the sink, I feigned a sudden loss of balance. I let my knees buckle slightly and I caught myself heavily against the edge of the kitchen island. "Watch what you are doing, you clumsy old fool," Courtney shouted, taking a step back to protect her wine. "Oh, I am so sorry," I mumbled, keeping my head down. In that split second of manufactured chaos, my hand slipped smoothly under the dark, heavy overhang of the granite countertop. I pressed the tiny magnetic recording device firmly against the hidden metal bracket holding the counter in place. It clicked silently into position, completely invisible to anyone standing in the room. I apologized again and slowly shuffled back toward the basement, leaving the perfect electronic spy right in the heart of her new kingdom. The basement was completely freezing by midnight, but I did not feel the cold. I sat on the edge of the stiff military cot, illuminated only by the faint glow of the single hanging bulb. I had waited 6 grueling hours in absolute silence before accessing the receiver paired with the hidden recording device. I placed the small wireless earbud into my right ear and pressed the playback button on the secure digital receiver. The audio feed was terrifyingly crystal clear. I could hear the clinking of wine glasses and the soft background noise of the television upstairs. Then I heard Devin's voice. He sounded incredibly tired and stressed. "Are you sure we are doing the right thing, Court?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant. The old man looked absolutely broken when they dragged that piano out. My stomach twisted at the sheer pathetic weakness in his voice. He knew it was wrong, but he was too much of a coward to stop it. Courtney's sharp, cruel laugh instantly pierced my ear. "Oh, stop being such a massive baby, Devin," she mocked. "He does not even know what day it is half the time. The judge will sign the final conservatorship order by the end of the month, and then we will have total legal control over this massive property." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, listening intently. Then the conversation took a sharp, completely unexpected turn. "You need to focus on your new job search, Devin," she continued. "Because as soon as the judge signs that paper, my brother is going to purchase this house from the estate." I froze completely still. Her brother was a notorious deadbeat who had filed for bankruptcy twice. How could he possibly buy a multi-million-dollar home? Devin sounded just as confused. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "I thought we were going to live here and raise the baby." Courtney's voice turned incredibly cold and entirely pragmatic. "Do not be stupid, Devin. This house is too old and the property taxes are absolutely massive. As the legal conservator, I can authorize a private off-market sale to my brother for pennies on the dollar to quickly liquidate the asset for Garrett's supposed medical care. My brother will then immediately flip the property to a corporate developer for $3 million. We split the massive profit under the table tax-free and buy a brand new mansion in the hills. We do not have to share a single dime with the government or your pathetic father." Devin stammered, clearly shocked by the sheer magnitude of her criminal scheme. "But Court, what if we get caught? That is massive real estate fraud." "You will not get caught if you keep your mouth shut," she snapped viciously. "I am securing our future while you are busy crying over an old piano." My blood turned to absolute ice. She was not just trying to live in my house. She was actively plotting an intricate real estate conspiracy to steal my legacy, launder the money through her deadbeat brother, and completely cut my own son out of his legal inheritance. She was going to leave Devin holding the bag while she walked away with millions. I was so intensely focused on the horrifying details of her criminal plot that I completely missed the soft creak of the wooden stairs. I did not hear the basement door open. Suddenly, the harsh, blinding glare of a bright tactical flashlight hit me directly in the face. I instantly ripped the earbud from my ear and shoved the digital receiver deep into the pocket of my heavy coat. "What are you doing down here in the dark?" Dad Devin's voice echoed loudly in the damp cellar. He was standing halfway down the stairs, holding his phone flashlight, trembling slightly. "What did you just put in your pocket?" He rushed down the remaining steps, his eyes wide with sudden, intense panic. "Give it to me," he demanded, reaching aggressively for my coat. I stepped back, protecting my pocket. "Back away, Devin." I warned, my voice dropping its frail disguise. His face contorted with fear and sudden rage. He lunged forward, gripping my shoulders, and violently shoved me backward. My boots slipped on the damp concrete, and I went crashing heavily to the unforgiving floor. The sharp pain of my shoulder hitting the damp concrete sent a shockwave entirely up my spine. For a fraction of a second, the sheer physical impact knocked the breath completely out of my lungs. Devin stood above me, his eyes wide with absolute horror at what his own two hands had just done. The bright beam of his flashlight shook violently as his trembling fingers lost their grip. The heavy metal cylinder clattered loudly against the floor, rolling into the dark corner and casting wild, frantic shadows across the basement walls. "Dad, I am so sorry," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "I did not mean to push you that hard. You startled me." Before he could even reach down to offer me a hand, the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs banged open. Courtney's brisk, confident footsteps clicked rapidly down the wooden steps. "What is all this screaming about?" she demanded, stepping into the dim light. She looked at me lying on the cold concrete and then looked at Devin's panicked face. Instead of showing an ounce of human concern, her eyes lit up with a wicked, predatory gleam. She immediately saw an opportunity to exploit the chaos. "Look at what you are doing to yourself, Garrett," she scolded, her voice dripping with fake pity. "You are wandering around in the dark, falling over your own 2 feet and getting violent with your own son. You are a massive danger to everyone in this house." She turned to Devin and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It is not your fault, honey," she cooed manipulatively. "His mind is completely deteriorating. He does not know what he is doing anymore. We need to get this sorted out right now before he seriously injures himself." Courtney reached into the deep pocket of her expensive cashmere cardigan and pulled out a neatly folded piece of thick legal paper. She unfolded it briskly and held it out toward me, her freshly manicured nails tapping impatiently against the crisp white edge. "This is a standard medical waiver," she lied smoothly, not breaking eye contact. "It just gives Devin and me the legal authority to hire a professional and home nurse to monitor you. If you sign this, we can finally get you the proper medical help you clearly need after a dangerous fall like this." I remained on the floor, propped up slightly on my good elbow. I let my head hang low, breathing heavily as if the fall had completely drained my remaining life force. I squinted at the document through the dim basement lighting. I did not need my reading glasses to recognize the standard bold formatting of a state court heading. It was absolutely not a medical waiver for a home nurse. It was a formal waiver of contest. If I signed my name on that specific dotted line, I was legally surrendering my constitutional right to challenge her emergency conservatorship petition in front of a judge. I would be willingly handing her the absolute keys to my entire life without a single fight. She wanted to use the physical trauma and emotional confusion of my fall to blindside me into signing away my freedom. I let out a long, pathetic sigh and allowed my right hand to tremble violently. My mind instantly flashed back to the blistering summer of 1998. I was managing a massive commercial build for a downtown corporate plaza. The lead architect kept making constant, aggressive changes to the master blueprints while we were already actively pouring the concrete foundation. Every time a change was made, we had to meticulously mark up the expensive drafting paper. If we used standard ink, a single mistake would ruin thousands of dollars worth of architectural prints. That was when I discovered the absolute magic of thermal friction pens. The special gel ink flowed smoothly like a premium ballpoint, but it was uniquely formulated to completely vanish when exposed to temperatures over 140 degrees Fahrenheit. I used to keep a high-powered industrial heat gun in my humid construction trailer. Whenever the architect changed his mind, I would simply run the heat gun over the blueprints, and the dark ink would instantly evaporate, leaving the paper completely pristine and untouched. I always kept one of those specific contractor pens clipped firmly inside the breast pocket of my heavy flannel shirt. It was an old, deeply ingrained habit from my decades on the active job site. "I need a pen," I muttered, my voice sounding weak and entirely defeated. Courtney smiled a terrible, victorious smile and quickly reached into her pocket to retrieve a cheap plastic ballpoint. "Here," she said, shoving it aggressively toward my face. "Just sign at the bottom next to the red sticker." I weakly pushed her hand away, letting my own arm shake uncontrollably. "No," I whispered, tapping my chest. "My hands are shaking too badly. I cannot grip that cheap plastic. I need my heavy drafting pen. It is the only thing thick enough for me to hold steady." I clumsily reached into my flannel pocket and pulled out my thick black friction pen. Courtney rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, exasperated sigh. "Fine," she snapped. "Just sign the paper, Garrett, so we can go back upstairs and sleep." She knelt down on the damp concrete, placing the legal document flat on the hard floor right in front of me. She pointed her sharp fingernail directly at the signature line. I took a deep, jagged breath and pressed the tip of the friction pen against the thick paper. To the naked eye, the ink flowed out in a rich, dark blue, perfectly mimicking a standard legal ballpoint. But I was not just writing my name. I pressed down with an immense, calculated physical force. I pushed the metal tip so hard into the paper that I could feel it carving a deep physical groove into the fibers of the document. The heavy pressure ensured that even when the ink completely vanished, the aggressive physical indentation of my handwriting would remain permanently scarred into the page. Furthermore, I did not sign my legal name. On every single official bank document and property deed, my signature is a precise, flowing cursive that explicitly includes my middle initial. As my hand shook with manufactured frailty, I deliberately omitted my middle initial entirely. I also subtly altered the sharp angle of my capital letters, transforming the official signature into a completely invalid forgery of my own name. I dragged the pen slowly across the page, selling the painful illusion of a confused old man struggling to remember his own identity. Devin watched me in absolute silence, still clutching his chest from the adrenaline of the physical altercation. He looked deeply ashamed, but he did not speak up. He simply watched his wife steal his father's life. I finished the final jagged stroke of the counterfeit signature and let the pen drop heavily from my hand as if the sheer effort had entirely exhausted me. Before the blue ink was even completely dry, Courtney violently snatched the paper from the concrete floor. She held it up to the dim basement light, examining the signature with incredibly greedy eyes. A massive, triumphant smirk spread across her face. "Perfect," she whispered, her voice dripping with absolute venom. She carefully folded the document and slipped it securely back into her pocket. "Come on, Devin," she commanded, standing up and brushing the basement dust from her expensive pants. "Let the old man sleep." They walked rapidly back up the wooden stairs, and the heavy door slammed shut, plunging me back into the cold, dark silence. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly, locking me inside. I sat up on the cold floor, brushing the dirt from my coat. I was not hurt. I was not broken. The pathetic shaking in my hands instantly vanished completely, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. They thought they had secured a massive legal victory. They had absolutely no idea they were holding a ticking time bomb written in vanishing ink. As soon as the first rays of morning sunlight broke through the tiny basement window, I reached into the hidden wall cavity and pulled out my secure communication device. I dialed a highly encrypted number I had saved for over a decade. Within 5 minutes, I had officially hired the most ruthless private forensic document examiner in the state to stand by for the upcoming court date. The trap was perfectly set. The weekend arrived with a suffocating wave of summer heat and the loud, obnoxious sounds of a backyard celebration. I sat on my stiff military cot in the dim basement, listening to the heavy thumps of footsteps crossing the main floor directly above my head. Courtney had invited her entire extended family over for a lavish Saturday afternoon barbecue to officially show off her brand new stolen estate. The rich, heavy smell of expensive prime rib, grilled asparagus, and sweet hickory smoke wafted through the floorboards, mocking my absolute isolation. I could hear the obnoxious clinking of expensive crystal glasses, the pop of imported beer bottles, and the booming, arrogant laughter of her relatives echoing through my backyard. They were treating my home like a conquered territory, celebrating their glorious victory over a helpless old man. To ensure her perfect high society facade remained completely unblemished, Courtney had gone a step further than just ordering me to stay downstairs. I walked over to the heavy wooden basement door and twisted the brass knob. It was completely rigid. She had physically locked the exterior deadbolt from the main hallway, trapping me in the damp cellar like an unwanted animal. She wanted to parade around my pristine garden, showing off the imported Italian stone patio I built with my own hands without the embarrassing presence of her supposedly demented father-in-law. She thought locking a heavy door would keep her dark secret safely buried in the basement. She thought she had completely neutralized the threat by tossing me into the dark and turning the key. She fundamentally misunderstood the man she was trying to imprison. You cannot lock a master builder inside a house he constructed from the foundation up. I walked over to my small, battered suitcase and pulled out a clean, crisp linen suit I had packed for emergencies. I took my time dressing carefully, buttoning the light blue collared shirt and adjusting my expensive leather belt. I brushed the basement dust from my polished dress shoes and combed my hair back with absolute precision. I was not going to emerge looking like the frail, confused victim she had described to her family. I was going to walk out looking exactly like the multi-millionaire owner of the estate. I approached the locked door and reached into my pocket, pulling out a thin piece of rigid tension steel I always kept on my keychain. During my decades managing massive commercial construction sites, I had to bypass hundreds of jammed deadbolts, broken lock cylinders, and secured temporary doors. The cheap residential lock Courtney had installed was an absolute insult to my experience. I slid the metal pick into the keyway, applied a gentle rotational pressure, and manipulated the internal pins with practiced ease. Within 10 seconds, the heavy deadbolt clicked open with a satisfying metallic snap. I pushed the door open and stepped into the bright hallway. I walked calmly through the pristine kitchen and pushed open the heavy sliding glass doors, stepping directly onto the sunlit patio. The sudden bright sunlight momentarily blinded me, but I kept my posture perfectly straight and my head held high. The backyard was completely packed with Courtney's relatives. They were lounging on my custom outdoor furniture, drinking my expensive liquor, and admiring my perfectly manicured gardens. Loud, obnoxious country music blared from the outdoor speakers. Courtney was standing by the large stainless steel grill, holding a silver pair of tongs and laughing loudly at a joke her uncle had just made. Then she turned around and saw me. The fake joyous laugh died instantly in her throat. She froze completely still, her eyes wide with absolute sheer panic. The silver tongs slipped from her manicured fingers and clattered loudly against the stone patio. The sudden sharp noise of the dropping tongs caused several guests to turn their heads. Soon the entire patio fell into a highly uncomfortable silence as dozens of eyes locked onto the impeccably dressed black man standing confidently on the edge of the stone patio. I did not look confused. I did not look frail. I looked like a wealthy executive completely in charge of his surroundings. Courtney's father, Richard, a tall, imposing man with a permanent sunburn and a condescending smile, broke from the crowd and walked toward me. He was holding a cold beer and carrying himself with the unbearable arrogance of a man who thought he was infinitely superior to everyone else. "Well, look who decided to join the party," Richard boomed, clapping me forcefully on the shoulder with a heavy, patronizing hand. "Courtney told us you were having a really tough time lately, Garrett. It is great to see you up and walking around." I smiled a tight, polite smile and gently but firmly removed his heavy hand from my tailored shoulder. "I am doing absolutely fine, Richard," I replied, my voice calm, resonant, and entirely steady. The sheer clarity of my tone clearly caught him off guard. He blinked twice, looking over at his daughter, who was now visibly hyperventilating by the grill. "Well, that is just fantastic news," Richard recovered, raising his beer bottle in a mock toast. "I really want to shake your hand, Garrett. It takes a big man to step aside and pass the torch. Giving the kids this beautiful house so they can start their family is an incredibly generous gesture. You really set them up for life." I let the silence hang in the warm summer air for 3 agonizing seconds. Every single guest on the patio was listening intently to our exchange. I looked Richard dead in the eyes, my polite smile never wavering but my gaze turning as cold as absolute ice. "That is a very interesting perspective, Richard," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the quiet yard. "But I am afraid there has been a massive misunderstanding. I have not given anyone anything. I just rent the basement." The reaction was immediate and absolutely devastating. A collective murmur of deep confusion rippled through the wealthy crowd. Richard's condescending smile vanished completely, replaced by a hard, bewildered frown. He spun around to look at Courtney, who was now trembling with pure, unadulterated rage. Her face flushed a dark, humiliating red. She had explicitly told them she owned the property outright. My simple, calculated sentence had just publicly exposed her as a massive liar in front of her entire arrogant family. I did not stay to watch the inevitable screaming match. I simply gave Richard a polite nod, turned around, and walked calmly back inside the house, leaving a trail of absolute social destruction in my wake. That night, long after the furious guests had abruptly left and the house fell into a tense, heavy silence, I lay awake on my basement cot. I could hear Courtney screaming at Devon upstairs, her voice raw and completely unhinged. Suddenly, a sharp, violent shattering sound echoed from the living room directly above me. It was not a piece of furniture being dropped. It was the distinct, devastating sound of heavy steel striking delicate porcelain. Courtney, humiliated and out of her mind with unbridled rage, had taken a hammer to the living room mantel. She was smashing Nadine's sacred cremation urn into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The sharp, violent sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the floorboards, pulling me out of the basement shadows. I did not bother with the lockpick this time. I took 2 steps back and kicked the heavy wooden door open with a massive surge of adrenaline that splintered the doorframe into jagged pieces of wood. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my heavy work boots pounding against the wooden treads. When I reached the main living room, the sight before me made my blood freeze completely solid in my veins. The beautiful hand-painted ceramic urn that had rested safely on the stone mantel for 5 long years was entirely gone. In its place was a barren, empty space. On the pristine hardwood floor lay hundreds of jagged white and blue porcelain shards reflecting the harsh overhead lights. Scattered among the broken pieces was a thick, heavy layer of pale gray dust, Nadine's ashes. The physical remains of the woman who had loved me deeply, the woman who had sacrificed her entire youth to build this family, were carelessly trampled into the wood grain. Courtney stood directly in the center of the room, her chest heaving violently with exertion. She was gripping a heavy steel claw hammer in her right hand, her knuckles completely white from the tight grip. The sheer malicious intent radiating from her eyes was absolute. She had not just broken a decorative object during a tantrum. She had deliberately attempted to erase the final physical memory of my wife from the face of the earth, out of pure spiteful humiliation after I embarrassed her in front of her family. I stepped fully into the living room, and the frail, confused old man persona died right there on the ashes of my beloved wife. I straightened my back to my full 6'2" height, rolling my broad shoulders and letting my massive frame cast a long, dark shadow across the ruined floor. Devin ran into the room from the kitchen, his face completely drained of color as he looked at the horrific mess on the floor and then at his wife holding the heavy hammer. Courtney took a small step backward, her arrogant smirk faltering slightly as she finally registered the profound physical change in my posture. I did not yell. I did not rush forward to strike her. My mind snapped violently back to the sterile, quiet hospital room where Nadine took her final agonizing breath. She had held my massive, calloused hand in her frail, thin one and asked me to keep her close to the heart of the home we built together. I promised her right then and there that I would protect her resting place with my absolute life. Courtney had just violated a sacred holy vow between a husband and his dying wife. I walked slowly toward her, the heavy rubber soles of my boots crunching loudly over the broken porcelain and bone dust. Devin tried to step between us, holding his hands up in a weak, pathetic, placating gesture, but I swatted him aside with the back of my forearm, sending him stumbling backward into the heavy leather sofa. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from Courtney, looking down into her suddenly terrified eyes. The absolute freezing cold authority in my voice filled the entire room, making the air feel instantly heavier and incredibly hard to breathe. "You just dug your own grave." I stated my words perfectly articulated and completely devoid of any human mercy. There was absolutely no shaking in my hands. There was absolutely no confusion or dementia clouding my eyes. There was just the pure, calculated promise of absolute destruction. The brutal realization hit Courtney like a physical blow to the chest. Her eyes darted wildly around the room as her highly manipulative brain finally processed the terrifying truth standing right in front of her. I was not senile. I was not suffering from rapidly progressing dementia. I was completely lucid, highly intelligent, and I had been playing a highly calculated tactical game from the very beginning. She looked at the heavy steel hammer in her hand, and then at the cold, murderous intent radiating from my absolute stillness. Cornered animals are incredibly dangerous, and Courtney was the absolute most vicious breed of predator. Instead of backing down or offering a pathetic apology, her dark survival instinct kicked into massive overdrive. She dropped the hammer, letting it thud loudly against the hardwood floor. She took a deep breath, raised her right fist, and violently punched herself squarely in her own left cheekbone. The sickening sound of hard knuckles hitting delicate facial bone echoed loudly through the silent room. A dark purple bruise began forming instantly under her pale skin. Devin screamed in pure horror, clutching his hair, but Courtney did not even flinch. She immediately grabbed her cell phone from her back pocket and dialed 911 with rapid, frantic fingers. The exact moment the emergency dispatcher answered, Courtney's voice completely transformed. The cruel, arrogant tone vanished entirely, replaced by the high-pitched, hysterical sobbing of a terrified, helpless victim. "Help me, please, you have to help me," she screamed into the receiver, dropping heavily to her knees and clutching her stomach defensively. "My father-in-law has gone completely insane. He broke out of his locked room and attacked me. He is hitting me in the stomach and I am 3 months pregnant. Please send the police immediately. He is trying to kill my unborn baby." She rolled onto the floor, kicking over a heavy wooden side table and a brass floor lamp to create a highly convincing scene of a violent physical struggle. She looked up at me from the floor, real tears streaming down her bruised face, while a wicked, victorious smile curled the corners of her lips. She thought she had found the absolute ultimate trump card. In the eyes of the legal system, a confused, aggressive old man brutally attacking a pregnant woman would result in immediate incarceration and an instant rubber stamp on her permanent conservatorship petition. I stood perfectly still, watching her theatrical performance with absolute detached clinical interest. I did not attempt to run or frantically defend myself to Devon, who was completely paralyzed by the sheer psychotic nature of his wife's actions. I simply reached deep into my pocket and pressed my thumb against the fabric, ensuring my secret audio recorder was still completely operational and capturing every single word. Within 5 short minutes, the piercing wail of police sirens tore through the quiet evening air of my suburban neighborhood. Heavy uniform boots pounded aggressively up the concrete front walkway, and the front door was kicked open by 2 large patrol officers with their service weapons drawn and ready. "Drop to the ground right now," the lead officer shouted, pointing the barrel of his gun directly at my chest. Courtney wailed even louder, pointing a trembling accusatory finger at me from the floor while cradling her stomach. I did not resist or try to explain the complex situation. Arguing with armed police officers is a fool's game. I slowly raised my hands into the air and lowered myself carefully to the hardwood floor, lying face down right next to the scattered ashes of my wife. Rough, forceful hands grabbed my wrists, twisting my arms painfully behind my back and locking heavy, cold steel handcuffs tightly around my skin. They hauled me roughly to my feet, treating me exactly like a highly violent criminal, while a team of paramedics rushed through the door to tend to Courtney's completely fabricated injuries. As the officers marched me aggressively out the front door, the harsh, rotating red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers illuminated the terrified, curious faces of my neighbors standing on their lawns. The officers pushed my head down and threw me aggressively into the cramped, hard plastic back seat of the patrol car, violently slamming the heavy metal door shut behind me. The concrete bench in the precinct holding cell was absolutely freezing, a sharp, miserable contrast to the thick, humid summer night radiating outside the small barred window. The heavy steel bars cast long, imposing shadows under the constantly flickering fluorescent lights of the county jail. I sat completely still in the dark corner, listening to the distant, aggressive shouts of intoxicated inmates and the heavy, metallic clatter of police radios. I did not sleep for a single second. I knew exactly what was happening miles away in my quiet suburban neighborhood. Courtney was absolutely not wasting a single fraction of my temporary incarceration. With a formal police report documenting a supposed violent assault against a pregnant woman, she had successfully acquired the ultimate temporary legal leverage she so desperately craved. She was actively using my forced absence to systematically strip my entire multi-million-dollar house completely bare. I could vividly picture her aggressively barking orders at a crew of emergency overnight estate liquidators, waving her emergency conservatorship petition around like a royal decree. She was ruthlessly boxing up decades of my hard-earned life. My expensive antique mahogany furniture, the rare first edition architectural books I had meticulously collected for 30 years, the imported Persian rugs, and the incredibly valuable oil paintings Nadine and I had purchased on our anniversary trips to Europe. Every single item of value was being rapidly loaded into massive, unmarked moving trucks under the dark cover of night. She was illegally converting my physical legacy into fast, untraceable cash before I could even stand in front of a judge to defend myself. She honestly thought putting me in a cage would break my spirit and force me to surrender. She did not realize she had simply given me the perfect quiet alibi while my own massive trap finally snapped shut. Morning finally broke with the harsh, deafening metallic screech of the main cell block door sliding open. A tired-looking, heavily armed guard called my name, pointing his heavy black baton toward the secure visitor interview rooms down the hall. I stood up slowly, smoothing the deep wrinkles from my crisp linen suit, and walked calmly down the stark, gray concrete corridor. Sitting patiently behind the thick, scratched, bulletproof glass in the attorney consultation booth was Aaron. He was wearing an impeccable tailored navy blue suit, looking completely out of place in the grim, depressing reality of the county jail. His sharp, calculating eyes scanned my face intensely, looking for any signs of physical abuse or mental exhaustion from the night behind bars. When he saw my calm, composed expression, a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "The precinct captain wants to set your bail at $50,000 due to the severe domestic violence enhancement," Aaron said, his voice buzzing clearly through the small metal speaker grill. "I can have you out of here in exactly 1 hour, Garrett. Just give me the official word and I will post the bond." I sat down heavily on the hard metal stool and leaned extremely close to the scratched glass. "I do not want bail." "Aaron," I whispered, my voice cold, hard, and entirely resolute, "I want to trigger Protocol Omega right now." Aaron's confident smile vanished completely, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, lethal professionalism. Protocol Omega was not a standard legal defense strategy. It was a completely scorched earth legal maneuver we had developed years ago to utterly destroy a massive, fraudulent corporate competitor who had aggressively tried to frame my construction company for structural negligence. It involved simultaneously unleashing an absolute avalanche of irrefutable digital evidence, freezing every single associated financial asset, and initiating highly aggressive federal countercharges that would completely paralyze the enemy before they could even react. It was the absolute nuclear option. "Are you absolutely certain?" Garrett Aaron asked, tapping his expensive silver pen deliberately on his leather briefcase. "Once I initiate this specific protocol, there is absolutely no walking it back. The authorities will take over, and she will face severe federal prison time for perjury and fraud." I looked at the blank concrete wall behind him, remembering the sickening, violent sound of Nadine's beautiful cremation urn shattering against the hardwood floor. I remembered the heavy cloud of bone dust settling into the wood grain. "She destroyed Nadine's ashes," I stated, my voice completely devoid of any human emotion. "I want her completely ruined. Do it now." Aaron nodded sharply, packing his legal documents back into his leather briefcase with rapid precision. He stood up without uttering another word and walked straight out of the visitor booth, heading directly for the precinct captain's main office. I sat back in the holding cell for another 2 agonizing hours, watching the digital clock on the wall tick away with methodical precision. I knew exactly what Aaron was doing in that upstairs office. He was sitting aggressively across from the lead detective and playing the highly encrypted audio file I had secretly uploaded to his secure server before the police even arrived at my property. It was the crystal clear recording captured by the tiny device I had masterfully planted under the granite kitchen island. The audio did not just capture her plotting real estate fraud with Devon. It captured a deeply disturbing conversation she had with her brother 2 days prior while she was drinking wine in my kitchen. On that recording, she explicitly detailed her malicious backup plan to permanently neutralize me if her conservatorship petition hit a legal roadblock. "If the old man tries to fight the court order, I will just bruise my own face and tell the cops he attacked my stomach," she had boasted, her voice dripping with pure sadistic confidence on the audio file. The juries and the cops always believe the crying pregnant woman over the large, angry black man. It is a foolproof strategy to get him locked up while we liquidate the estate and disappear with the cash. The lead detective, a seasoned, hardened veteran who had spent decades dealing with manipulative, violent criminals, listened to the audio in absolute stunned silence. The sheer, undeniable proof of her premeditated perjury and the highly calculated weaponization of the domestic violence system was a massive slap in the face to the entire police department. Aaron did not stop there. He presented the precise time-stamped digital metadata, proving the recording was entirely authentic, unaltered, and captured entirely within the legal bounds of my own primary residence. The entire tearful narrative Courtney had aggressively sold to the responding officers completely collapsed into absolute dust. The heavy steel door of the cell block buzzed loudly and slid open once again. The same tired guard walked up to my cell, but this time he was holding my personal belongings in a clear plastic bag. "Your lawyer is waiting for you out front, Mr. Garrett," the guard said, looking at me with a brand new expression of deep, respectful apology. "All charges have been completely dropped. You are a completely free man." I walked out of the depressing county jail, stepping directly into the blinding, warm afternoon sunlight. Aaron was waiting patiently by his sleek black town car parked at the curb. He handed me the keys to my pickup truck, which he had already retrieved from the city impound lot to save me the trouble. I drove back to my quiet suburban neighborhood, feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of absolute vindication settling into my chest. When I finally pulled into my long concrete driveway, the massive moving trucks I had envisioned were completely gone. The heavy front door was unlocked, swinging slightly open in the warm summer breeze. I walked inside, and the sharp, hollow echo of my boots confirmed my absolute deepest suspicions. The entire massive house was completely empty. Every single piece of furniture, every beautiful rug, every expensive painting, and every high-end appliance had been ruthlessly stripped from the property. The living room was a barren wooden wasteland stripped of all life and history. But as I turned around and looked out the large front window, a cold, incredibly victorious smile touched my lips. She had illegally taken all my possessions, but sitting right there in the middle of the driveway, gleaming perfectly in the afternoon sun, was her precious $100,000 Range Rover. I stood perfectly still in the center of my barren living room, the thick, heavy silence of the empty house pressed against my ears. Where there used to be a lifetime of carefully curated memories, there was now nothing but bare hardwood floors and faint rectangular outlines on the painted walls where my expensive artwork used to hang. I walked slowly toward the large front window, my heavy boots echoing hollowly against the bare wood. I looked through the glass at the pristine driveway. Sitting right there, mocking my entire existence, was the massive midnight black Range Rover Courtney had fraudulently purchased using my stolen financial identity. She had liquidated my entire physical estate, but she had carelessly left her most prized possession incredibly vulnerable. I reached into the pocket of my linen suit and pulled out my cell phone, which the precinct guard had returned to me upon my release. I did not dial the local bank branch this time. I dialed the direct emergency line for the Federal Fraud Investigation Unit of the National Auto Finance Corporation. When the senior fraud investigator answered, I did not mince words. I clearly identified myself and provided my social security number. I informed him that my attorney had just successfully defeated a malicious false arrest charge and that we were officially filing federal identity theft charges regarding the six-figure auto loan attached to my name. I provided the investigator with Aaron's direct contact information and the precise legal docket number proving the medical proxy Courtney had used was entirely fraudulent and actively under criminal investigation. The investigator typed rapidly on his end of the line. The tone of his voice immediately shifted from bureaucratic indifference to high alert. When a massive financial institution realizes a $100,000 unsecured asset is tied to active federal identity theft, they do not politely ask for the keys back. They completely panic. The investigator formally placed the loan into immediate default status and authorized a hyper-expedited recovery order. The trap was set. Less than an hour later, a sleek silver luxury rideshare pulled smoothly up to my curb. The back doors opened and Courtney stepped out, followed closely by Devin. They were both carrying multiple large designer shopping bags from the most expensive high-end maternity boutiques in the city. They were actively spending the untraceable cash they had stolen from liquidating my beautiful home. Courtney walked up the front steps with a wide, arrogant smile on her face, completely expecting to find the house entirely empty and me rotting away in a cold county jail cell. She pushed the front door open and strutted into the hallway. When her eyes adjusted to the indoor lighting and she saw me standing calmly in the center of the empty living room, she gasped loudly, dropping a highly expensive leather baby bag directly onto the floor. Devin nearly tripped over his own feet, his jaw hanging completely open in absolute shock. "You," she stammered, her eyes darting around the empty room as if looking for the police officers she thought had locked me away forever. "How are you out of jail?" "They denied your bail." I crossed my arms slowly, leaning back against the bare wall. "The charges were completely dropped, Courtney." I stated, my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of any emotion. "It turns out the police do not take kindly to fabricated domestic violence claims." Her initial shock quickly morphed into a defensive, venomous sneer. She picked up her designer bag and marched fully into the room, projecting a completely false sense of ultimate authority. So what she spat, gesturing aggressively to the massive empty space around us. "You are out of jail, but you have absolutely nothing left. I sold it all, Garrett. Every single piece of your pathetic antique furniture, every rug and every painting. The cash is already completely hidden. You can stand here in your empty house all you want, but you are going to be sleeping on the bare floor tonight." She walked past me, heading toward the kitchen with a triumphant strut. "The conservatorship hearing is this Friday," she called out over her shoulder. "The judge is going to look at your empty house, your erratic behavior, and the police report I filed, and he is going to hand me the permanent keys to your entire life. You lost old man. Get used to the floor." I looked down at the bare hardwood floor beneath my boots. Her cruel words were intended to break my spirit, but they only ignited a deep, powerful memory. I remembered the brutal, scorching summer of 1974. I was a young, incredibly desperate man trying to provide for my pregnant wife. I took a grueling contract laying cheap hardwood flooring in a massive, dilapidated apartment complex across the city. I spent 12 hours a day on my hands and knees driving heavy steel nails into stubborn wood with a manual mallet. My knee pads wore completely thin, and my joints ached with a blinding, agonizing pain that made it difficult to even walk to my truck at the end of the shift. I bled onto those floors. I destroyed my own physical body so I could save enough money to buy a small house with soft, thick carpet where Devin could safely learn to crawl. I built my entire world from the absolute ground up through sheer, agonizing physical labor. Courtney had never worked a hard day in her entire miserable life. She thought stripping my house of its furniture meant she had stripped me of my foundational strength. She did not understand that the man standing in front of her was forged in absolute fire. She had only removed the decorations. The solid concrete foundation of my willpower remained completely untouched and incredibly lethal. Suddenly, the aggressive, deafening roar of a massive heavy-duty diesel engine shattered the quiet suburban afternoon. The loud hiss of pressurized air brakes echoed through the front windows, causing Courtney to stop dead in her tracks in the kitchen. Yellow strobe lights flashed intensely, reflecting off the bare living room walls. I did not move a single muscle, but a cold, terrifyingly satisfied smile slowly spread across my face. Courtney dropped her designer bags on the granite counter and rushed frantically to the front window, pressing her hands against the glass. A massive industrial tow truck painted a dull, intimidating gray had backed up aggressively into my driveway. The massive steel hydraulic lift was already deployed, sliding rapidly underneath the front axle of her pristine midnight black Range Rover. "What are they doing?" she screamed, her voice cracking with sudden intense panic. "Devin, run out there and stop them right now." Devin stood completely frozen in the hallway, staring blankly at the massive truck. Because I had filed the formal federal fraud affidavit, the bank had bypassed all standard repossession protocols. They did not send a polite notice in the mail. They sent a specialized rapid recovery agent to seize the highly valuable asset before the criminals could hide it. The heavy steel chains clanked loudly as the repo agent, a massive, heavily tattooed man in a high-visibility vest, expertly locked the tires into the hydraulic cradle. Courtney ripped the front door open and sprinted barefoot down the concrete driveway, waving her arms like a complete maniac. "Stop! You cannot take that!" she shrieked at the top of her lungs, grabbing desperately at the thick steel chains. "That is my vehicle. I am pregnant. You cannot do this." The repo agent did not even look at her. He completely ignored her hysterical screaming as if she were nothing more than a mild gust of wind. He engaged the massive hydraulic winch. With a loud mechanical groan, the front end of the $100,000 luxury status symbol was violently yanked into the air, its rear tires completely locked. The agent casually walked back to the cab of his truck, climbed up the heavy metal steps, and slammed the door shut. Courtney pounded aggressively on the driver's side window, her face contorted in absolute furious agony, as she watched her ultimate prize, her rolling throne of stolen wealth, being legally confiscated. The massive diesel engine roared to life, and the tow truck pulled forcefully out of the driveway, dragging the Range Rover down the street. Courtney stood barefoot in the middle of the road, screaming obscenities until her voice went completely hoarse. The entire neighborhood was watching through their windows. She slowly turned around and marched back up the driveway, her eyes locking onto me, standing calmly in the open doorway. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket, her hands shaking with absolute violent rage. "You think you are so smart, Garrett," she hissed, her voice dripping with sheer venom. "You think taking my car changes anything?" She tapped her screen aggressively, holding it up so I could see the display. She was sending a massive video file directly to her corrupt lawyer's email. It was a highly sophisticated artificial intelligence deep fake video she had purchased on the dark web. It perfectly superimposed my face onto the body of a deranged homeless man wandering aimlessly through busy city traffic in a hospital gown. "The judge is going to see this video on Friday," she snarled viciously. "He is going to see a severely demented old man who needs to be permanently locked inside a heavily medicated psychiatric ward. You are going to die chained to a hospital bed, Garrett." My cell phone vibrated violently against my leg just as Courtney stormed up the wooden stairs to her stolen bedroom. I pulled the device from my pocket and saw Aaron's highly encrypted number flashing on the bright screen. I answered immediately, pressing the phone tight against my ear while keeping my eyes locked on the empty hallway. "Garrett, we have a massive problem," Aaron said, his voice uncharacteristically tense and rushing over the secure line. Courtney's legal team did not wait. They submitted an emergency supplemental filing to the court 10 minutes ago and attached a highly disturbing video file. "They are claiming you wandered away from the house today and were found heavily disoriented in moving traffic." I walked toward the kitchen, keeping my voice to a harsh, absolute whisper. "It is a fabricated, deep, fake video, Aaron," I explained coldly. "She just showed it to me on her phone to gloat. She bought it on the dark web to secure her victory." Aaron let out a sharp, frustrated exhale. "I know it is a fake, Garrett," he replied quickly. "You and I both know you are completely lucid. But the presiding judge is notoriously conservative when it comes to the physical safety of the elderly. He saw that highly sophisticated video and completely panicked. He bypassed the standard review process entirely. The emergency conservatorship hearing has been officially fast-tracked to this Friday morning at 9 o'clock. The judge issued a temporary physical detainer. If you do not show up to court on Friday with absolute undeniable proof of her massive financial crimes, he is going to sign the permanent order and authorize state medical officers to have you forcibly committed to a locked psychiatric ward. We have exactly 48 hours to completely destroy her narrative." I ended the call and stood in the absolute silence of the empty kitchen. 48 hours. Courtney thought she had backed me into an inescapable corner with her digital forgery. I needed hard, undeniable forensic proof of her specific financial crimes to present directly to the judge. I needed the exact routing numbers and the destination accounts for the massive amounts of cash she had stolen from liquidating my estate. I waited in the dark kitchen for 3 agonizing hours. The house was completely quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Without any of my expensive furniture, the upstairs bedrooms were just empty wooden boxes. Courtney and Devin were forced to sleep on cheap inflatable air mattresses they had purchased earlier that day, when I was absolutely certain they were entirely unconscious. I moved. I took the stairs silently, placing my heavy boots on the very edges of the wooden treads to avoid the familiar creaks. I bypassed the master bedroom and slipped quietly into the small guest room Devin was using as his makeshift home office. A single cheap folding table sat in the center of the bare room, holding Devin's expensive silver laptop. The screen was dark, but the power light pulsed rhythmically. I stepped up to the table and pressed the spacebar. The bright screen illuminated the dark room, asking for the primary user password. Devin had always been an incredibly predictable boy. He was deeply anxious as a child, completely terrified of thunderstorms and the dark. To help him cope, Nadine and I had bought him a golden retriever named Buster. That dog was his absolute emotional crutch, his loyal protector until it passed away when Devin was in high school. Even as a grown man, Devin clung desperately to the safe, comforting memories of his childhood. I placed my large, calloused fingers on the incredibly thin keyboard and typed the word Buster, followed by the year the dog was born. I pressed the Enter key. The security lock immediately vanished, granting me total administrative access to his entire digital life. I did not care about Devon's personal work files or his pathetic internet browsing history. I opened his primary web browser and went straight to the synchronized cloud storage accounts. Devon was incredibly lazy with his digital security, often leaving all of his accounts completely logged in and permanently linked to Courtney's devices for convenience. I navigated through the digital folders until I found a hidden encrypted email account that Courtney had carelessly left open on a secondary browser tab. I clicked on the inbox and began scrolling rapidly through the outgoing messages. What I found was a massive, intricate web of pure, unadulterated financial treason. Courtney was not just hoarding the cash from my liquidated furniture in a secret offshore savings account. She was actively bleeding the estate dry through a highly organized series of massive wire transfers. I opened the attached bank receipts and studied the destination names. The money was being aggressively funneled into a private commercial account registered to a man named Hunter. I dug deeper, opening the attached invoices and digital receipts. Hunter was a highly expensive private personal trainer who worked at the elite luxury fitness club Courtney frequented on the other side of the city. The digital receipts were absolutely staggering. She was not paying for simple fitness routines. She was using my stolen retirement funds to buy him highly expensive luxury watches, first-class flights to tropical resorts, and massive direct cash infusions labeled as private consultation fees. In the last 3 weeks alone, she had wired this man over $40,000 of my hard-earned money. She was systematically draining my entire life savings to actively fund a lavish secret lifestyle with a man who was not my son. The sheer blinding scale of her betrayal was absolutely magnificent in its pure wickedness. I sat in the dark room, illuminated only by the harsh blue light of the laptop screen, downloading every single wire transfer receipt, every hotel booking, and every hidden email directly to my secure encrypted flash drive. As I prepared to log out and erase my digital footprints from the machine, a final highlighted email at the very top of her secret inbox caught my eye. It was sent to Hunter just 2 days ago, and it contained a single high-resolution image attachment. The subject line was completely blank. I clicked on the small paperclip icon and the image downloaded, rapidly expanding across the center of the screen. It was a black and white medical ultrasound photograph clearly showing the distinct profile of a 12-week-old fetus. I looked at the digital text typed directly below the medical image. Courtney had added a short personalized caption before hitting send. "Our little secret Hunter," she had written. "I absolutely cannot wait to spend the old man's millions with you and our beautiful son." I stared at the screen while the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The final absolute piece of the puzzle snapped violently into place. The pregnancy. The very child Devon had used as his ultimate moral shield to justify destroying his own father. The baby Courtney was constantly weaponizing to garner sympathy from the police and the courts. It was a complete biological lie. The baby was not Devon's. I stared at the harsh blue light of the laptop screen until my eyes physically burned. The black and white ultrasound image of the 12-week-old fetus seemed to mock the absolute core of our family. Our little secret. The words typed so casually by Courtney echoed loudly in the dark silence of the empty guest room. Devon had repeatedly weaponized this unborn child against me. He had stood in my kitchen and justified financing a $100,000 luxury vehicle with my stolen identity under the pathetic guise of ensuring the safety of this baby. He had allowed his vicious wife to banish me to a damp, freezing basement, lock the heavy wooden door, and brutally smash his own mother's sacred cremation urn, all to protect the delicate stress levels of a pregnant woman. And the child did not even belong to him. Courtney was actively orchestrating the total destruction of my life to fund a lavish future with her wealthy white personal trainer, while my pathetic son played the role of the obedient, financially drained biological shield. I pulled the encrypted flash drive from the side of the laptop, feeling the cold, solid metal against my calloused palm. I closed the silver laptop, leaving it exactly as I had found it. I had the absolute undeniable proof. I had the massive financial wire transfers, the expensive hotel receipts, and the ultimate biological betrayal all locked safely inside my pocket. I stepped out of the makeshift office and walked silently down the dark hallway. As I passed the master bedroom, the door was pushed slightly open. I stopped and looked inside the barren room. Without my expensive mahogany bedroom set, the massive space looked completely pathetic. Devon and Courtney were sleeping on a cheap, queen-sized, inflatable air mattress pushed against the far wall. I looked at my son. His face was buried deep in a thin pillow, his shoulders rising and falling with a heavy, exhausted rhythm. For a fleeting fraction of a second, a sharp, agonizing pang of profound paternal pity struck my chest. He was completely trapped in a toxic nightmare of his own, making utterly blind to the fact that the woman sleeping next to him was a parasitic monster, feeding on his total emotional weakness. I remembered a warm Sunday afternoon when Devon was 9 years old. I had taken the training wheels off his bicycle. He fell hard on the rough concrete, scraping his knee badly and tearing his jeans. He sat on the sidewalk crying hysterically, declaring he would never ride a bike again. I knelt down, wiped his tears with my rough hands, and told him that a man must always stand back up and face his pain directly because the world has absolutely no mercy for cowards who refuse to fight for themselves. I spent 40 years trying to instill that exact iron resilience into his spine. I worked double shifts until my hands bled just to make sure he had a strong, secure foundation to stand on. But looking at him now, curled up on an air mattress in a house he helped steal, I realized my son had never learned that vital lesson. He had actively chosen the path of the ultimate coward. The fleeting pity vanished entirely instantly, replaced by the sharp physical memory of his hands violently shoving me backward onto the damp concrete basement floor. I remembered the exact look of cowardly panic in his eyes as I fell. I remembered him standing completely silent while Courtney forced me to sign away my constitutional rights with a vanishing ink pen. He was not an innocent victim caught in the crossfire. He was a highly active, willing participant in my execution. The final remaining shred of my fatherly empathy died completely right there in the dark hallway. There would be absolutely no mercy. It was time for total nuclear annihilation. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun crested the horizon on Thursday morning, casting a pale orange glow across the empty living room, I quietly slipped out the front door and climbed into my pickup truck. Courtney and Devin were still fast asleep, completely unaware that the solid ground beneath their feet was about to entirely disappear. I drove downtown through the early morning traffic to a highly secure private wealth management firm located on the top floor of a sleek glass high-rise building. Aaron had arranged this emergency meeting with a senior real estate broker who specialized exclusively in rapid anonymous corporate asset transfers. When I walked into the massive glass conference room, the broker, a sharp, meticulous woman in a tailored gray suit, already had the extensive paperwork completely prepared and waiting on the polished marble table. We did not exchange pleasantries. I pulled the original physical deed to my property from my fireproof folder and placed it firmly on the table. For 30 years, my name had proudly sat on the top line of that heavy parchment. It represented every drop of sweat, every freezing winter morning, and every sacrifice Nadine and I had ever made. Now I was signing it away. But I was not losing my kingdom. I was making it completely invisible to my enemies. Using the complex network of offshore holding companies I had established a decade ago, I formally initiated a rapid quitclaim transfer. I legally sold the entire multi-million-dollar estate, including the primary residence, the sprawling half-acre lot, and the detached luxury garage, to an anonymous private corporate trust based in the Cayman Islands. As the sole hidden beneficiary of that specific trust, I retained absolute ultimate control over the property, but my personal name was entirely erased from the public county tax records. I picked up the heavy gold pen the broker offered me. My hand did not shake. I signed my full legal name with precise flowing cursive, pressing the ink firmly into the thick paper. The broker meticulously verified my state identification, stamped the documents with her official heavy notary seal, and immediately filed the electronic transfer directly with the county clerk's office via a secure digital portal. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the massive transaction was officially recorded in the heavily guarded state database. The legal implications of what I had just done were absolutely devastating. If the conservative judge signed the permanent conservatorship order on Friday morning granting Courtney total legal control over my physical assets, she would be inheriting absolute jurisdiction over a man who legally owned nothing. The house she was currently sleeping in, the house she had brutally stripped of all its beautiful furniture, was now technically owned by a faceless foreign corporation. She could not sell it to her brother. She could not take out a secondary mortgage on it. She was nothing more than a highly temporary squatter living in a completely empty box. I walked out of the towering glass building and stood on the busy city sidewalk, breathing in the warm, thick summer air. I checked the screen on my cell phone. It was Thursday afternoon. The countdown to absolute destruction was rapidly approaching zero. I drove back to my quiet suburban street, but I did not pull into my own driveway. I parked my heavy truck a few houses down, killing the engine and just watching my former property through the windshield. The house looked exactly the same on the outside. The pristine lawn I had manicured, the solid brick walls I had pointed, and the large front windows were all identical. But its fundamental reality had been entirely legally rewritten. I sat in the driver's seat for hours, watching the sun slowly go down and the automatic streetlights flicker to life across the neighborhood. I watched Devin walk out to check the mail, looking nervously up and down the street. I watched the lights turn off in the upstairs master bedroom as they went to sleep, believing they had completely won the war. As the digital clock on my dashboard clicked over to exactly midnight Thursday, officially bled into Friday. The final electronic property records updated across the vast municipal servers, locking the transfer into absolute permanent legal stone. On paper, as of this exact second, I was a completely penniless, destitute old man with absolutely zero liquid assets and no physical property to my name. Tomorrow morning was the mandatory emergency court date. Courtney was going to walk into that downtown courtroom wearing a modest dress and expecting the judge to crown her a multi-million-dollar queen. She had absolutely no idea she was stepping directly onto a perfectly rigged financial landmine. The harsh morning sunlight cut aggressively through the high, dusty windows of the downtown courthouse, casting long, imposing shadows across the wide marble corridor. I sat completely still on a hard wooden bench wearing my best charcoal gray tailored suit, feeling the familiar intense adrenaline of a high-stakes construction bid pumping rapidly through my veins. The heavy double doors of the elevator chimed loudly at the far end of the hall and slid open, revealing Courtney and Devin. I almost let out a dark, bitter laugh at her highly calculated appearance. The woman who had just spent $40,000 of my stolen money on luxury watches and tropical vacations for her personal trainer was currently dressed exactly like a struggling working-class housewife. She wore a faded beige cardigan over a cheap floral maternity dress, her normally perfect salon blowout completely replaced by a messy, unkempt bun. She had deliberately scrubbed off all her expensive designer makeup, leaving her face incredibly pale and purposefully accentuating the faint yellow remnants of the fading bruise she had violently given herself days prior. She was playing the role of the exhausted, devoted daughter-in-law pushed to the absolute psychological brink by a dangerous, elderly man. It was a masterful theatrical performance designed entirely to manipulate the deeply conservative judge. She clutched a thick stack of medical files tightly against her chest, leaning heavily on Devin's arm as they walked slowly down the corridor, dragging her feet to simulate profound physical exhaustion. She did not look like the ruthless predator who had smashed my wife's urn. She looked like a terrified victim. Courtney walked purposefully past me, keeping her eyes firmly averted, heading straight for her expensive legal team who were conferring quietly near the massive courtroom entrance. Devin, however, stopped dead in the middle of the hallway. He looked at me, his tired eyes darting nervously toward the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, and then back to my perfectly calm face. He looked physically sick. The dark, heavy circles under his eyes betrayed a profound lack of sleep, and his cheap suit hung loosely on his shaking frame. He took a hesitant, cowardly step toward my bench, his hands wringing together in a pathetic display of extreme anxiety. "Dad," he began, his voice barely a weak trembling whisper echoing off the cold marble walls. "Please just let this happen peacefully today. Do not fight it. We are doing this for your own good. I promise we will make sure you are comfortable in a very nice facility." I did not move a single muscle. I did not turn my head to acknowledge his miserable presence. I kept my eyes locked completely forward, staring intensely at the intricate brass detailing on the courtroom doors. In the past, I had always been incredibly quick to forgive Devin's endless transgressions. When he was a reckless teenager and completely wrecked my expensive work truck joyriding with his friends, I grounded him, but I still paid the massive insurance deductible out of my own pocket without a single complaint. When he dropped out of his first year of college, wasting thousands of dollars in tuition, I simply put my heavy arm around his shoulder and told him we would figure out a new solid plan together. I had spent my entire adult life acting as a permanent shock absorber for his constant catastrophic failures. I always believed it was my duty as a father to catch him when he fell. But the man standing in front of me now was absolutely not my son. He was a weak, cowardly accomplice to a massive biological and financial fraud. He was actively helping a vicious parasite steal my life while happily raising another man's child on my dime. The emotional bridge that had connected us for 35 years was not just burned, it was completely obliterated, turned to absolute ash and scattered in the wind just like his mother's beautiful cremation urn. I let the freezing, terrifying silence stretch between us until the crushing weight of my total rejection forced him to physically take a step back, hanging his head in deep, profound shame. The heavy oak doors swung open with a loud thud, and the stern bailiff called our specific case number. I stood up slowly, smoothing my jacket, and walked confidently into the stark, austere courtroom. Aaron was already sitting at the polished defense table, organizing his pristine legal folders with absolute lethal precision. He gave me a single sharp nod as I took the heavy leather seat next to him. Across the wide aisle, Courtney was sitting at the petitioner's table, aggressively dabbing at her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue, while her high-priced, arrogant attorney arranged his massive binders. The judge, a stern-looking older man with deep lines carved into his face, entered the room. Everyone stood as he aggressively slammed his wooden gavel, demanding absolute silence. He immediately stated that he had heavily reviewed the highly disturbing video evidence submitted the previous day and was prepared to make a swift, permanent ruling regarding my physical and financial autonomy to ensure the safety of the public. Courtney's lawyer stood up aggressively, buttoning his expensive suit jacket. He launched into a highly dramatic, heavily rehearsed monologue. He painted me as a tragically confused, highly violent old man suffering from acute, rapidly progressing dementia who was a massive threat to his own family. He aggressively pointed to the police report citing the fabricated domestic violence incident as absolute undeniable proof that I was a massive physical threat to a delicate pregnant woman. Then he moved to the core financial aspect of the petition. Your Honor, my incredibly brave client is not just asking for physical custody to ensure this poor man's safety. The lawyer boomed, his voice echoing loudly across the silent paneled room. We are formally requesting immediate and total conservatorship over his entire massive financial estate. We have the certified bank records indicating a net worth of approximately $3.5 million, including a highly valuable primary residence and substantial liquid corporate dividends. My client needs absolute total control over these massive assets to properly fund the highly expensive 24-hour specialized psychiatric care Mr. Garrett so desperately requires. She is willing to take on this massive, horrific burden out of pure family love. He slid the thick stack of forged medical proxies and the invalid vanishing ink waiver directly across the high wooden bench toward the judge. They wanted absolutely everything. They wanted to permanently lock me in a medicated cage and steal the keys to my kingdom. The judge slowly adjusted his heavy reading glasses carefully, reviewing the massive stack of fraudulent documents presented before him. The sheer, staggering weight of the requested financial transfer hung heavy in the tense courtroom air. The judge looked up, his stern, uncompromising gaze locking directly onto our defense table. Mr. Aaron, the judge said, his deep voice completely devoid of any warmth or patience. These are incredibly serious allegations supported by highly disturbing visual evidence and sworn medical affidavits signed by your own client. The petitioners are requesting total permanent control over your client's life, liberty, and a $3.5 million estate. Does the defense have any formal legal objections to the immediate implementation of this permanent conservatorship? Courtney completely stopped dabbing her fake tears. She lowered her crumpled tissue and cast a slow, sideways glance at me, a wicked, incredibly triumphant smirk twisting her lips. She was absolutely certain she had successfully driven the final nail into my coffin. Aaron stood up slowly, deliberately buttoning his tailored navy suit. He looked directly at the judge, offering a smooth, perfectly relaxed smile that completely defied the gravity of the room. Actually, Your Honor, Aaron stated, his clear voice ringing out with absolute lethal confidence, we do not object to the conservatorship at all. The words hung in the sterile courtroom air like a thick, heavy fog. We do not object to the conservatorship at all. The reaction across the room was instantaneous and incredibly profound. Courtney's lawyer stopped shuffling his massive binders and looked up with a highly visible expression of complete bewilderment. He had spent the last 10 minutes aggressively building a massive hostile narrative, completely expecting Aaron to launch a vicious counterattack. Instead, Aaron had simply stepped aside and opened the gates. Across the wide center aisle, Courtney let out a sharp, audible gasp of pure, absolute triumph. Her posture instantly changed. The hunched shoulders of the exhausted victim vanished completely, replaced by the arrogant, rigid spine of a victorious predator. A massive, greedy smirk spread across her pale face, stretching from ear to ear. She leaned over and whispered something sharply into Devon's ear. Devon let out a massive, trembling sigh of profound relief. The heavy, crushing guilt that had been visibly eating him alive for the past 48 hours seemed to instantly evaporate from his shoulders. He slumped back into his heavy wooden chair, wiping a layer of cold sweat from his forehead. He actually believed the brutal war was completely over. He believed his father had finally surrendered to their absolute authority. The stern judge looked down from his high wooden bench, mildly surprised by the sudden, complete lack of legal friction. He nodded slowly, appreciating the rare efficiency of a peaceful resolution in his highly congested courtroom. Very well, the judge stated, his deep voice echoing clearly across the paneled room. If the defense formally concedes to the medical necessity of this action, I will sign the permanent order transferring all physical and financial proxy rights to the petitioner immediately. The judge reached out with a steady hand and picked up his heavy gold fountain pen. He pulled the thick final ruling document toward the center of his desk, uncapping the pen with a soft metallic click. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, my breathing slow and completely controlled, watching the sharp gold nib of the pen hover just a fraction of an inch above the crisp white parchment. Before a single drop of ink could touch the legal page, Aaron took a highly calculated step forward. He raised his right hand just slightly, keeping his posture incredibly relaxed but projecting a terrifying, lethal authority. However, Your Honor, Aaron stated, his voice cutting through the quiet courtroom celebration like a sharpened steel blade. While we absolutely do not object to the general concept of a protective conservatorship, we must vehemently object to the highly fraudulent fabricated documents the petitioner has submitted to secure it. The judge stopped, his hand freezing completely in midair. Courtney's triumphant smirk instantly vanished completely, replaced by a sharp, rigid scowl of intense confusion. Her expensive lawyer jumped aggressively to his feet, violently slamming his hands flat against his table. "Objection, Your Honor!" The opposing lawyer shouted, his face turning a bright flush pink. "This is a highly disruptive and entirely inappropriate courtroom stunt." Opposing counsel just formally conceded the case, and now he is making wildly baseless accusations of fraud to waste the court's valuable time. The judge silenced the lawyer with a sharp, aggressive bang of his heavy wooden gavel. He looked directly at Aaron, his eyes narrowing with intense judicial scrutiny. "You are walking a very dangerous line." "Mr. Aaron," the judge warned, his tone completely devoid of any patience. "You just stated you do not object. Now you are alleging formal document fraud. Explain yourself immediately, or I will hold you in contempt." Aaron did not flinch. He walked calmly toward the center podium, bridging the gap between our defense table and the high judicial bench. "Your Honor, my client spent 4 highly successful decades as a master commercial contractor." Aaron began, his voice steady and incredibly smooth. "In that specific cutthroat industry, catching fraudulently altered architectural blueprints and forged financial change orders is a matter of absolute survival. He learned very early on exactly how to protect himself against vicious predators who try to alter contracts in the dark." Aaron reached into the inner pocket of his tailored navy suit and pulled out a simple, polished silver metal lighter. He placed it gently on the edge of the wooden partition directly in front of the judge. My client was forced to sign that specific medical waiver under extreme physical duress in a locked basement. But he did not use a standard pen. We formally request that the court verify the absolute authenticity of the signature on the waiver currently sitting on your desk. I ask you, Your Honor, to simply apply an open flame to the bottom of that page." Courtney's lawyer erupted into another frantic, furious round of loud objections, waving his arms and calling the request an absurd theatrical circus act that completely insulted the dignity of the state court. He demanded the judge sign the final order immediately and throw us out of the building. But the judge, a highly experienced legal veteran who had presided over decades of complex, incredibly bitter family disputes, was deeply intrigued by the sheer unprecedented nature of Aaron's bold request. Judges despise being lied to, and the absolute supreme confidence radiating from Aaron was impossible to simply ignore. The judge silenced the opposing counsel with another deafening strike of the gavel, demanding absolute total silence in his courtroom. He looked down at the small silver lighter resting on his partition, and then looked at the thick medical waiver Courtney had submitted as her ultimate proof. He picked up the metal lighter. He flicked his heavy thumb over the ignition wheel. A small, bright orange flame sparked violently to life, casting dancing shadows across the high wooden bench. Courtney stood up slightly from her chair, her knuckles turning completely white as she gripped the edge of the petitioner's table. She remembered the freezing, damp basement. She remembered shoving the cheap plastic pen away from my hand and watching me pull my own heavy black drafting pen from my flannel coat. Her breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid. The judge picked up the medical waiver, holding it carefully by its top edge. He slowly passed the open orange flame just a few inches beneath the bold signature line, keeping the intense heat steady, but not close enough to scorch the paper. In less than 3 agonizing seconds, the absolute chemical magic of the thermal friction ink aggressively activated. The dark blue signature that Courtney thought was her ultimate golden ticket completely evaporated into thin air. The ink vanished entirely, dissolving into absolutely nothing, leaving a stark blank white space exactly where my name used to be. A collective, highly audible gasp echoed rapidly through the packed courtroom gallery. Devin buried his face entirely in his trembling hands, but Aaron was absolutely not finished. "Now, Your Honor," Aaron instructed, pointing his expensive pen directly at the blank space on the paper. "Please angle the document directly toward your overhead desk lamp and closely examine the deep physical indentations left behind by the heavy pressure of my client's pen." The judge complied, tilting the heavy parchment backward. The harsh, bright desk light cast tiny, dark shadows into the deep, aggressive grooves I had deliberately carved into the thick paper fibers. The judge squinted, leaning incredibly close to the document. The deep pen grooves did not spell my name. They spelled out a completely different, highly legible phrase carved permanently into the page. "Signed under extreme duress. This is a forged document." The dead, heavy silence that immediately descended upon the massive courtroom was absolutely deafening. The judge slowly lowered the piece of paper, his face turning a dark, incredibly dangerous shade of crimson. The sheer absolute audacity of the crime committed directly inside his courtroom radiated from his rigid posture. He placed the silver lighter down onto his desk with a heavy, sharp metallic clink that echoed through the room like a loud gunshot. He turned his intense, furious gaze directly toward Courtney's table. Courtney was completely frozen solid, her mouth opening and closing in rapid succession like a suffocating fish, but unable to form a single coherent syllable. The absolute terror of federal perjury charges was visibly crashing down upon her shoulders. Her highly expensive, arrogant lawyer stared at the blank page in absolute unadulterated shock, visibly shrinking backward under the intense, lethal judicial scrutiny. He realized instantly that his client had just dragged his pristine legal career directly into a massive federal fraud conspiracy. The judge leaned far forward over his high wooden bench, his knuckles turning completely white as he gripped the polished edge of the desk. He glared directly at Courtney's lawyer with a look of pure, unfiltered, absolute wrath. "This is a blatant, highly calculated forgery," the judge boomed, his incredibly deep voice shaking the very walls of the room. "Explain this immediately before I order the bailiffs to lock the doors and hold both you and your client in criminal contempt of court." The absolute sheer panic that seized Courtney's face was something I will remember for the rest of my life. Her mouth opened and closed, but the arrogant, manipulative words she had relied on for months completely failed to materialize. She looked wildly at her high-priced lawyer, seeking a lifeline that simply did not exist. It must be some kind of clerical error," she finally stammered, her voice shrinking into a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. "The hospital must have given us the wrong form." The judge did not blink. His steely gaze remained entirely fixed on her, seeing right through the pathetic, transparent lie. Her lawyer, realizing his pristine professional reputation was rapidly going up in flames, aggressively stepped away from her at the petitioner's table. He desperately needed to pivot the court's attention away from the glaring federal forgery before he was held personally liable as a co-conspirator. "Your Honor," the opposing lawyer shouted quickly, wiping a thick layer of cold sweat from his forehead with a silk handkerchief. "While we completely withdraw that specific medical waiver due to highly suspicious administrative irregularities, the core foundation of our emergency petition remains absolutely intact. We have sworn affidavits detailing Mr. Garrett's deeply erratic behavior. He is clearly suffering from severe cognitive decline. We formally demand immediate protective control over his physical person, and more importantly, a strict legal injunction to freeze his $3.5 million real estate assets. He is entirely incompetent to manage a massive estate of that size, and my client is stepping up to protect that property from ruin." Aaron let out a soft, incredibly dry chuckle that echoed clearly across the tense courtroom. He calmly picked up his heavy leather briefcase and unclasped the brass locks. "Incompetent," Aaron repeated, letting the word hang in the air like a ridiculous joke. "Your Honor, opposing counsel is attempting to paint my client as a frail, confused man, incapable of managing his own shoelaces, let alone a multi-million-dollar financial portfolio. That narrative is not just factually incorrect. It is a complete and absolute insult to one of the most brilliant architectural minds in this state." Aaron pulled a massive, highly organized stack of legally certified documents from his briefcase. The thick binder was heavily tabbed with bright red markers and embossed with the heavy raised seals of the state treasury and the county clerk's office. My mind briefly flashed back to the bitter, freezing winter of 1992. A bitter rival developer had anonymously reported my construction firm to the Internal Revenue Service, hoping to completely paralyze my business during a massive bidding war. The federal government sent 3 aggressive field agents to audit 10 years of my intricate corporate finances. They spent 3 grueling weeks tearing through my office looking for a single misplaced decimal point to justify freezing my commercial accounts. I did not panic then either. I calmly handed them flawlessly maintained ledgers that left absolutely zero room for legal interpretation or bureaucratic exploitation. I learned a vital lesson that winter. In the vicious world of high-stakes finance, your paperwork is your ultimate armor. You do not leave a single gap for a parasite to crawl through. Aaron walked confidently toward the high judicial bench, carrying that exact same impenetrable armor. He dropped the massive stack of certified documents directly onto the judge's desk with a heavy, incredibly satisfying thud. "My client is perfectly competent. Your Honor." Aaron stated, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. In fact, he is so incredibly competent that exactly 24 hours ago, he successfully executed a flawless, complex international real estate transfer that requires a level of deep financial literacy most seasoned corporate lawyers do not even possess. The judge adjusted his heavy reading glasses, pushing the forged medical waiver aside and pulling Aaron's thick binder to the center of his desk. The entire courtroom fell into a dead, suffocating silence as the judge began to read through the top pages of the certified file. The sharp rustle of the thick parchment turning in the quiet room sounded like the slow ticking of a massive bomb. Courtney's eyes darted frantically between the judge and Aaron, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. Devin sat completely frozen, his hands gripping the wooden arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles were stark white. The judge flipped to the third page, his eyebrows rising significantly toward his hairline. He looked up from the document, staring directly at Courtney's lawyer with a look of profound, absolute pity. "Counselor," the judge began, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute finality. "You are standing in my courtroom demanding total financial control over a massive multi-million-dollar estate. But according to these fully verified county records, your incredibly brave client is fighting for absolutely nothing. Courtney's lawyer blinked rapidly, stepping forward with profound confusion. "I do not understand, Your Honor," he stammered. "The property is appraised at over $3 million. The judge shook his head slowly, tapping his gold pen against the thick file. "The property you are referring to is legally owned by an anonymous offshore corporate trust headquartered in the Cayman Islands," the judge explained, reading directly from the certified deed transfer. "As of midnight last night, Mr. Garrett formally quitclaimed his entire ownership stake in the primary residence, the surrounding land, and all associated physical assets. He liquidated his domestic corporate dividends completely. Under the strict eyes of the law, Mr. Garrett's personal net worth is exactly $0.00. He is a legally destitute man." Courtney let out a sharp, strangled gasp, gripping the edge of her table as if the floor had just vanished beneath her feet. But Aaron was not finished delivering the absolute killing blow. "That is entirely correct, Your Honor," Aaron added, stepping back to our defense table with a smooth, confident glide. "My client does not own a single physical asset in this country. However, there is one minor financial detail remaining on his personal ledger." Aaron pulled a single crisp piece of paper from his suit pocket. "To facilitate the massive offshore transfer, my client had to trigger a highly specific early withdrawal penalty. As a result, Mr. Garrett currently carries a manufactured but highly legally binding debt to the Internal Revenue Service in the exact amount of $10,000. Aaron turned slightly, looking directly into Courtney's terrified, widening eyes. "If the court grants the petitioner the permanent conservatorship she is desperately begging for, she will not gain access to a $3.5 million estate. She will be legally assigned absolute fiduciary responsibility for a penniless man. The law clearly states that a formal conservator must use their own personal finances to provide adequate housing, medical care, and daily sustenance for their ward if the estate is completely empty. Furthermore, she will be legally obligated to immediately clear his federal tax liabilities." Aaron turned back to the judge, offering a polite, highly dangerous smile. "So, Your Honor, if the petitioner wishes to assume a $10,000 federal debt and pay out of pocket to house and feed my client for the rest of his natural life, we absolutely welcome her incredible generosity. We do not object to the conservatorship." The absolute magnitude of the financial trap violently slammed into Courtney. The brilliant, sophisticated scheme she had spent months meticulously planning had just mutated into a massive, inescapable prison. She had spent $40,000 of stolen cash on her personal trainer. Her luxury vehicle had just been aggressively repossessed. And now she was standing in a federal courtroom fighting for the legal right to take on massive tax debt and pay out of her own empty pockets to care for the very man she despised. The sweet, innocent victim facade she had carefully painted completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. The sheer, blinding rage and absolute greed bubbling just beneath her skin violently erupted for the entire courtroom to witness. She spun around violently, her cheap floral dress whipping around her legs, and lunged aggressively toward Devin. "You told me he was rich," she screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, her face contorted into a mask of pure demonic fury. Her shrill voice echoed violently off the high marble ceilings, causing the courtroom bailiffs to instantly jump to their feet. "You swore to me the house was entirely paid off, Devin. You said the estate was ours. You useless, pathetic coward. You told me we were going to be millionaires." She grabbed the lapels of his cheap suit, violently shaking him back and forth right in the middle of the open courtroom. "You let him hide the money. Where is my house? Where is my money? I did not get pregnant just to end up completely broke living in the dirt with a loser like you." The heavy wooden gavel slammed violently against the judge's sound block, echoing like rapid gunfire over Courtney's hysterical screaming. "Order! I will have absolute order in this court," the judge bellowed, his face flushed with intense judicial anger. Two armed bailiffs instantly stepped forward, placing their hands firmly on their duty belts, prepared to physically separate Courtney from her husband. Courtney released Devin's cheap suit jacket, panting heavily, her chest heaving as she glared at me with absolute venom. Devin slowly straightened his wrinkled lapels, looking completely shell-shocked by his wife's sudden vicious outburst. Despite the undeniable reality of her sheer greed completely exposing itself in front of the entire room, he still desperately clung to the singular illusion that kept his fragile ego intact. He took a hesitant, cowardly step away from his furious wife and turned his deeply bloodshot eyes toward the defense table. "Dad, why are you doing this to us?" he pleaded, his voice cracking loudly in the silent, tense courtroom. "Why are you purposely destroying everything we built? She is just incredibly stressed out because we are trying to prepare for the baby. She is carrying your only grandson." He pointed a trembling finger at me, desperately trying to reclaim some pathetic moral high ground. "You are acting like a cruel, heartless monster trying to leave a pregnant woman completely destitute. We just wanted to make sure you were safe, and you are aggressively punishing us for trying to build a family. You are trying to ruin your own bloodline." I did not let him finish his pathetic, desperate speech. I placed my large hands flat against the polished wood of the defense table and slowly pushed myself up from the heavy leather chair. The frail, hunched posture of the defeated old man completely vanished entirely, evaporating into the cold courtroom air. I straightened my spine, pulling my broad shoulders back and standing at my full imposing height. The sheer physical transformation in my demeanor seemed to suck the remaining oxygen straight out of the large paneled room. I looked down at my son, not with anger, but with the cold, detached authority of a king observing a treasonous peasant in his throne room. I remembered the exact moment the hospital nurse first placed Devin into my massive, calloused hands 35 years ago. He was so incredibly small, wrapped tightly in a thin, striped receiving blanket. I had stood in the quiet, sterile hospital room looking down at his tiny, fragile face, and I made a solemn, sacred vow to God. I swore I would build an absolute fortress to protect him from the vicious cruelties of the outside world. I spent 40 years breaking my own back, breathing in toxic concrete dust, missing family dinners, and sacrificing my own physical health to lay the impenetrable bricks of that massive fortress. I gave him a life completely devoid of real hardship or desperate hunger. I wanted to raise a strong, resilient prince who could one day rule the empire I had forged in dirt and sweat. But in my relentless effort to completely shield him from the violent storms of life, I had accidentally raised a remarkably weak man. I had built a massive fortress, but left the heavy iron gates wide open for a ruthless parasite to simply walk inside and claim the throne. I looked at the pathetic man wearing a cheap suit, actively defending the very woman who had just violently smashed his own mother's cremation urn. "You dare to stand in a federal courtroom and lecture me about protecting a family?" I stated, my voice resonating with deep, absolute thunder. "You allowed that vicious woman to lock your own father in a damp, freezing basement. You stood by completely silent while she forged my legal signature to steal my life savings. And you did it all under the pathetic, cowardly excuse of protecting your unborn child." I turned slightly and extended my hand toward Aaron. My lawyer smoothly opened his heavy leather briefcase and placed a thick black folder directly into my open palm. I looked up at the high judicial bench. "Request permission to approach the petitioner, Your Honor?" I asked, my tone perfectly calm and respectful, completely contrasting the heavy tension in the room. The judge, still deeply disturbed by Courtney's violent outburst, gave a slow, silent nod of approval. I walked deliberately across the wide center aisle, my heavy boots making a slow, rhythmic thud against the polished marble floor. Courtney physically recoiled, taking a terrified step backward until her spine hit the heavy wooden railing separating the gallery. I ignored her entirely, stopping exactly 1 foot in front of Devin. I held the thick black folder out to him. "Read it," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying whisper that only the three of us could clearly hear. Devin looked at the dark folder as if it were a highly venomous snake prepared to strike. His trembling hands slowly reached out and flipped open the heavy black cover. The very first page was a highly detailed printed spreadsheet documenting over $40,000 in massive wire transfers completely drained from the liquidated estate funds. Devin squinted at the paper, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What is this?" he mumbled. "Who is Hunter?" I watched his pale face closely as he flipped to the second page. It contained the printed digital receipts for luxury hotel suites, high-end designer watches, and massive private consultation fees, all paid directly to a local luxury fitness club. "Hunter is your wife's highly expensive private personal trainer." I explained, the cold words striking him like brutal physical blows to the stomach. "You thought she was liquidating my antique furniture to secure your financial future. She was actively bleeding the estate entirely dry to secretly fund a lavish illicit lifestyle with another man. Look at the dates, Devin. She was booking luxury resort weekends with my stolen money on the exact same day she claimed she was resting in bed with severe pregnancy complications." Devin shook his head rapidly in deep, frantic denial. "No, that is impossible," he stammered, his hands shaking violently as he frantically turned to the very last page in the thick file. He stopped completely dead. The remaining color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrifying pale ghost. Staring up at him from the crisp white paper was the high-resolution black and white medical ultrasound image I had downloaded directly from his own compromised laptop. Below the medical image, the typed digital caption screamed the absolute horrific truth into his retinas. "Our little secret, Hunter. I absolutely cannot wait to spend the old man's millions with you and our beautiful son." I stepped incredibly close to Devin, looking directly into his shattered, terrified eyes, watching his entire universe completely collapse in real time. "She is carrying Hunter's son," I stated, my voice completely devoid of any human mercy. "And you happily paid for it with the money you stole from your dead mother." The heavy black folder slipped from Devin's entirely numb fingers, hitting the courtroom floor with a loud, sharp slap. The printed emails and bank transfers scattered wildly across the polished marble. His knees instantly buckled beneath his weight, completely giving out as the absolute magnitude of the ultimate betrayal violently crushed his fragile reality. He collapsed heavily into his wooden chair, letting out a loud, horrific sound that was half scream and half desperate gasp for air. He buried his face deep into his trembling hands, sobbing completely uncontrollably, his shoulders violently shaking as his entire life completely disintegrated in front of a packed federal courtroom. The painful, agonizing wails of a thoroughly broken man echoed off the high-paneled walls. Courtney realized in that exact terrifying fraction of a second that her massive, intricate web of lies had been utterly, completely destroyed. She had lost the house, she had lost the money, and her ultimate biological shield had just been completely detonated. She was facing immediate federal charges for perjury, massive wire fraud, elder abuse, and criminal forgery. Pure, unadulterated panic completely hijacked her central nervous system. She spun around, entirely abandoning her weeping husband, and sprinted aggressively toward the heavy double oak doors at the back of the courtroom. Her cheap shoes slapped loudly against the floor as she prepared to run straight out of the building and disappear into the busy city streets to avoid impending arrest. But before her frantic hand could even touch the brass door handle, two massive federal marshals stepped smoothly out from the dark shadows of the back corridor. They crossed their heavy, muscular arms, physically blocking the only exit with their broad, imposing frames, staring her down with absolute zero tolerance. The judge did not hesitate for a single second. He looked directly at the two massive federal marshals blocking the heavy oak doors and issued a swift, absolute command. "Arrest that woman immediately," the judge boomed, pointing his wooden gavel directly at Courtney. "I am officially remanding her into federal custody pending formal charges for criminal forgery, felony, wire fraud, and severe elder abuse." The courtroom erupted into pure, chaotic noise as the marshals moved forward with brutal, unyielding efficiency. Courtney kicked and screamed like a feral, terrified animal as they forced her arms behind her back and locked heavy, cold steel cuffs tightly around her wrists. Her pathetic, desperate cries echoed down the marble hallway as she was dragged away, completely stripped of her stolen wealth, her fake pregnancy, and her manufactured dignity. Fast forward exactly 48 hours. The heavy, humid summer air clung to the quiet suburban street as Devin walked slowly up the long concrete driveway of my estate. He looked like a completely hollow, shattered shell of a human being. He was carrying a cheap, black plastic trash bag meant to collect whatever pathetic scraps of clothing he had left behind in the master bedroom. He reached the front porch and slid his key into the heavy brass deadbolt. It hit a solid metal wall and did not turn. The locks had been professionally changed yet again. He rattled the brass handle violently, his shoulders slumping forward in absolute, total defeat. I remembered teaching him how to fix a broken lock when he was just 12 years old, showing him patiently how the internal tumblers needed to align perfectly to open a closed door. He had completely broken the trust that aligned our family, and now all the doors in his life were permanently shut. The heavy front door swung open, but I was not the one standing in the threshold. A massive, heavily armed private security guard wearing a crisp black uniform stepped out onto the porch. He did not say a single comforting word. He simply handed Devin a thick white legal envelope. Inside was a permanent federal restraining order barring him from ever stepping foot on trust property again, accompanied by a highly itemized invoice for the exact replacement cost of a custom ceramic cremation urn. Devin looked up, tears streaming freely down his pale face. I was sitting comfortably in the plush leather back seat of a sleek black Lincoln Town car parked quietly across the street. The dark-tinted window rolled down with a soft mechanical hum. Devin locked eyes with me, his mouth opening to beg for a final ounce of unearned forgiveness. I did not speak. I gave my son a single freezing cold nod of absolute finality. The dark-tinted window rolled smoothly back up, and the heavy car pulled away from the curb, leaving him standing entirely alone in the dirt. 6 months later, the gentle, salty breeze of the Mediterranean Sea completely washed away the bitter memories of that brutal summer. I sat comfortably on the private teak balcony of a massive luxury cruise ship, feeling the warm afternoon sun on my face. I raised a heavy crystal glass of premium aged bourbon, taking a slow, highly satisfying sip. The dark amber liquid burned pleasantly in my chest, a toast to my absolute hard-won freedom. The heavy, suffocating chains of unreciprocated obligation had been completely severed. Blood makes you related, I thought, watching the endless crystal blue horizon stretch out before me. But loyalty makes you family. And disrespect makes you a total stranger. The greatest lesson I learned is that unconditional love should never mean unconditional surrender. We spend our entire lives building a safe foundation for our children, hoping they will honor our sacrifices. But sometimes the people we protect the most become the predators we never expected. Generosity without strict boundaries is simply an open invitation for absolute exploitation. You must always protect your own peace and secure your legacy before someone else attempts to claim it. If my story resonated with you today, please hit the like button, leave a comment below, and subscribe to my channel for more videos.